In the heart of Rome's bustling Macellum, enslaved merchants, sharp-witted captives from distant lands, wove the empire's wealth with every coin and calculation, their lives bound by chains, yet flickering with defiance. How did these unsung traders, whose minds fueled Rome's markets, find strength to resist an empire that owned them? And what secrets did they hide in the shadows of commerce? Story 1. The Origins of Captivity. How Wars Filled Roman Slave Markets. Imagine yourself standing on the dusty plains of a conquered land, the air thick with the smoke of burning villages and the distant cries of the defeated. This is where the story of Roman slavery often began, in the grand forums of Rome, but on the battlefields far from the eternal city. As a listener drifting into the quiet folds of history, you might picture the legions marching triumphantly, their standards gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. But beneath that glory lay a system that turned human lives into commodities, fueling an empire that spanned continents. Roman slavery wasn't born from ideology alone. It was a practical extension of conquest, where the victors claimed the vanquished as property. You can almost feel the weight of chains being forged in the aftermath of war, as prisoners were rounded up like cattle, their futures rewritten in the ledgers of Roman ambition. In the early days of the Republic, around the 4th century BCE, slavery was already woven into the fabric of Roman society, but it exploded in scale with the Punic Wars against Carthage. Hannibal's invasion of Italy in 218 BCE brought terror to Roman doorsteps. Yet Rome's eventual victory in 146 BCE led to the destruction of Carthage and the enslavement of tens of thousands. Picture the survivors: men who had fought valiantly, women who tended hearths, children who played in the streets, now stripped of their identities and marched across the sea. Historical records, like those from Polybius, describe how entire populations were sold off, with prices fluctuating based on age, strength, and skills. A strong young man might fetch 500 denarii, equivalent to a year's wages, for a free laborer, while the elderly or infirm were discarded or worked to death in menial tasks. You, as an observer in this narrative, might wonder at the banality of it all. Scribes tallying numbers, merchants haggling, as if lives were mere amphorae of wine. The mechanisms of capture were methodical, almost bureaucratic in their efficiency. Roman generals, such as Scipio Africanus, would divide spoils systematically: gold to the treasury, land to the state, and people to the markets. War captives, known as servi, formed the bulk of slaves, but piracy and debt bondage added to the influx. In the eastern provinces, after conquests like those in Greece following the Battle of Corinth in 146 BCE, educated Hellenes were prized for their knowledge, yet treated no better than beasts of burden. You can envision the long columns snaking through mountain passes, guarded by centurions who enforced discipline with whips and short swords. Thirst and exhaustion claimed many en route. Survivors arrived in ports like Ostia, blistered and broken, only to face the auction block. The Venelicium, or slave market, was a place of stark routine. Platforms where individuals stood naked, chalk marks on their feet indicating foreign origins, placards around necks listing attributes like healthy or literate. Buyers poked and prodded, assessing teeth and muscles as one might inspect livestock at a fair. This system wasn't chaotic. It was sustained by laws like the Lex Alea Sensia, which regulated manumission but reinforced ownership. Slaves had no rights. They were res mancipi things to be owned. Yet, in the tedium of daily oversight, masters often delegated management to overseers who tracked inventories with the same precision as grain silos. You might reflect on how this brutality was normalized. Embedded in texts like Cato, the Elders de Agricultura, which advised treating slaves like tools, work them hard, feed them minimally, and replace when worn out. Diets were sparse barley porridge, olives, and salted fish calculated to sustain labor without excess. Healthcare was rudimentary. A sick slave was a liability, often left to recover or perish in cramped barracks. As the sun sets on these scenes of subjugation, you sense the undercurrents of resentment simmering among the chained masses. How long could such a system endure without fracture? What sparks might ignite the flames of rebellion in the hearts of those deemed property? Picture yourself now in the bustling heart of Rome, where the echoes of conquest settle into the rhythm of daily life. You're standing near the Forum, the air heavy with the scent of olive oil and dust, as merchants shout their wares and the clink of coins fills the space. Among the goods are human beings, their fates sealed in the slave markets that hum with cold efficiency. The captives you saw on distant battlefields have arrived here, their journeys from war-torn lands to the eternal city complete, but their ordeal far from over. The question lingering from the battlefields, how a system so brutal could function so seamlessly, finds its answer in the meticulous organization of Rome's slave trade. This was no haphazard enterprise. It was a cornerstone of the economy, as vital as grain or marble, and you can sense the weight of its machinery grinding forward. The slave markets, like those in Ostia or the Subura district, were spectacles of commerce. Imagine the scene. Wooden platforms creak under the weight of chained men and women, their eyes downcast as wealthy buyers circle. Historical sources, such as the writings of Seneca, describe how slaves were displayed like livestock, with placards detailing their origins, Thracian, Gaul, or Syrian skills, from weaving to accounting. Prices varied widely. A skilled Greek scribe might cost 10 times more than an unskilled laborer, as noted in inscriptions from Pompeii. You might notice the chilling practicality. Children were often separated from parents, sold to different households to break familial bonds and ensure compliance. The elderly, less valuable, might be sent to rural estates for back-breaking work, or simply abandoned if deemed useless. The market's rhythm was relentless. Auctions ran daily, with thousands sold annually during Rome's expansionist peak in the 2nd century BCE. Beyond the market, the journey of a slave continued into the households, fields, or mines of their new masters. You can imagine a young woman from Carthage, once a weaver in her village, now serving in a patrician's villa. Her day begins before dawn, grinding grain or scrubbing floors, her movements watched by an overseer with a rod. Literary evidence, like the works of Columella, details how slaves were assigned tasks based on ability. The strong were sent to fields, the educated to administrative roles, and the rest to domestic drudgery. Food was minimal: barley cakes and water, sometimes supplemented with cheap wind designed to sustain without nourishing. Living quarters were grim, cramped, windowless rooms called ergastula, where slaves slept on straw or bare earth. You might feel the chill of these spaces, the air stale with despair, as slaves whispered in languages from distant lands, sharing fragments of their lost lives. Yet the system's efficiency hid cracks. Slaves weren't mere tools. They were human, capable of defiance. Small acts of resistance, sabotaged work, stolen food, or whispered plans hinted at unrest. Legal texts, like the Digest of Justinian, reveal harsh punishments, flogging, branding, or crucifixion for minor infractions. But these measures betray the Romans' fear of rebellion. You can almost hear the murmurs in the ergastula at night, the stories of uprisings like the one in Sicily in 135 BCE, where slaves briefly seized control. The system thrived on control, but control is never absolute when humans are involved. As you linger in this world of calculated oppression, a question emerges. Could the seeds of resistance, sown in these small acts, grow into something larger? What would it take for these whispers to become a roar? You stand now at the edge of a sprawling Roman estate, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over fields worked by countless slaves. The whispers of resistance you heard in the cramped ergastula have lingered in your mind, and here, in the twilight of this brutal system, you see its consequences unfold. The question from the markets, whether those quiet acts of defiance could spark something greater, finds its answer in the fragile balance between control and rebellion. The Roman slave system, built on conquest and sustained by commerce, was a machine of efficiency, but it was not unbreakable. You can feel the tension in the air, as if the very soil beneath your feet holds the stories of those who dared to challenge their chains. The First Servile War, 135 to 132 BCE in Sicily, offers a glimpse into this breaking point. Enslaved workers, many captured from Rome's eastern conquests, toiled on vast agricultural estates called latifundia. Historical accounts, like those of Diodorus Siculus, describe how a Syrian slave named Eunice, claiming prophetic powers, rallied thousands to revolt. You might imagine him standing before a weary crowd, his voice rising above the crackle of a makeshift fire, promising freedom. The uprising captured entire towns, and for a moment, slaves held power. Rome's response was merciless. Legions crushed the rebellion, crucifying survivors along Sicilian roads as a warning. Yet, this was not an isolated spark. Smaller revolts flared across the empire, from runaway slaves forming bandit groups to subtle sabotages in households. Each act chipped away at the myth of Roman invincibility. You can almost see the overseers' growing unease, their ledgers now tracking not just labor but loyalty. The system endured, though, because Rome adapted. Laws tightened Lex Pompey in 89 BCE, restricted slave movements, franned rewards for informants, created mistrust among the enslaved. Manumission, the rare path to freedom, was dangled as a carrot. A loyal slave might earn liberty, as seen in inscriptions honoring freedmen like Gaius Julius Zoilos, who rose to wealth after serving Caesar. But for most, freedom remained a distant dream. You might picture an aging slave, once a warrior in Gaul, now limping through his tasks, his spirit worn but not extinguished. The sheer scale of slavery estimates suggest 10 to 20% of the empire's population were slaves. By the 1st century BC meant Rome's economy depended on their labor. From the aqueducts you marvel at today to the bread on patrician tables, slaves were the unseen foundation. Reflecting on this, you might wonder how this system shaped our world. The brutality of Roman slavery left scars, not just on bodies, but on the very idea of freedom. The rebellions, though crushed, planted seeds of resistance that echo in later struggles. Think of abolitionist movements centuries later. Rome's reliance on slaves also sowed its own decline. An economy built on forced labor stagnated, unable to innovate. As you drift through this history, consider the resilience of those who endured. Their small acts of defiance, a testament to the human spirit. Their names may be lost, but their labor and resistance built the world we inherit. What might their stories teach us about the cost of power and the value of liberty? Story to daily toil in the households. Invisible servants of the elites step into the heart of a Roman villa, where the morning light filters through marble columns and the scent of fresh-baked bread wafts from the kitchen. You're in the world of Rome's elite, but your gaze falls not on the patricians lounging in their atriums, but on the slaves who move silently in the shadows, ensuring the household hums with order. These were the invisible hands that polished mosaics, stoked fires, and served wine at lavish banquets. Their lives, though rarely recorded, were the backbone of Rome's opulent domestic life. As you walk these halls, you might sense the weight of their labor. Each task a thread in the fabric of an empire built on subjuction. In the 1st century BCE, a wealthy Roman household could house dozens of slaves, each assigned specific roles with mechanical precision. Literary sources, like Petronius Satiricon, paint a picture of sprawling villas where slaves were as ubiquitous as furniture. A pedicicus trailed their master, carrying sandals or messages. A nomenclator memorized names to prompt their forgetful owner during social events. You can imagine a young boy, perhaps captured from a Gallic village, tasked as an ornatrix, combing his mistress's hair with bone combs, his hands trembling under her impatient gaze. Women slaves often worked in the kalina, the kitchen, grinding spelt or kneading dough for hours, their arms aching from repetitive strain. Men might serve as atriences, managing household supplies, their days filled with endless inventories of oil lamps and amphorae. The routine was grueling, yet meticulously structured. Slaves rose before dawn, as described in Calumella's agricultural treatises, their tasks dictated by the household's rhythm. Food was meager barley porridge or crusts left from the master's table, served in cramped quarters, where slaves slept on straw mats. Hygiene was minimal. A shared basin of water sufficed for washing, and illness often meant neglect. You might picture the flicker of oil lamps as slaves worked late, cleaning silverware or repairing tunics, their efforts unnoticed unless flawed. Mistakes invited punishment, a whipslash for a spilled goblet or a broken dish, as recorded in legal texts like the Digest. Yet, these slaves were not just laborers. They were extensions of their master's status. A well-run household signaled wealth, and slaves were trained to perform with precision, their exhaustion hidden behind a facade of efficiency. That the elite depended on this labor, yet rarely acknowledged it. Slaves were instrumentum vocale, speaking tools percado, the elders' cold terminology. Some, especially Greeks, brought skills like literacy or music, elevating their value but not their status. You might hear a soft lullaby from a slave nurse soothing a patrician child, her own children sold or lost to the market. These personal connections, fraught with imbalance, wove complex dynamics into the household. Slaves overheard secrets, witnessed scandals, yet their voices were silenced by law. Their existence was a paradox, indispensable, yet invisible, human, yet owned. As you linger in this villa, you might wonder, how did these slaves endure such relentless toil? What thoughts stirred in their minds as they served, unseen, in the heart of Rome's grandeur? Now, imagine the villa at dusk, as the household prepares for a grand cena, the Roman dinner party where status is flaunted through excess. You see slaves scurrying, their movements precise yet hurried, arranging couches, lighting lamps, and carrying platters of roasted peacock and balsam-soaked figs. The question of how they endured such toil lingers, and here, in the flurry of activity, you glimpse the delicate balance of fear, resilience, and survival that define their existence. These slaves were not just workers. They were actors in a carefully choreographed performance, their every move scrutinized to uphold their master's reputation. The hierarchy within the household was rigid, mirroring Rome's broader social order. At the top was the villicus, a slave overseer who managed others, a position of relative privilege but immense pressure. Historical records, like those from Pliny the Younger, describe vilici as enforcers of discipline, ensuring tasks were completed without error. You might picture a villicus, perhaps a Thracian, who earned trust through years of service, barking orders to younger slaves while fearing his own punishment for their failures. Below him were specialized roles. The lanista trained slaves for entertainment, teaching dance or recitation, while cubiculari tended to private chambers, privy to their master's most intimate moments. These roles demanded skill, yet offered no security. A slip in performance, wine spilled during a toast, or a misstep in a dance could lead to flogging or worse. As juvenile satires grimly note, survival meant adaptation. Slaves learned to anticipate their master's whims, reading moods to avoid punishment. You can envision a kitchen slave, her hands calloused from grinding, slipping an extra olive to a fellow worker, a quiet act of solidarity. These small gestures, shared food, whispered encouragements, built fragile networks of trust. Yet, betrayal was a constant risk. Some slaves, hoping for favor or manumission, informed on others, as seen in legal cases, preserved in the Corpus Juris Civilis. The promise of freedom, though rare, was a powerful motivator. A slave might earn manumission through exceptional loyalty, like saving a master's life. But inscriptions from Rome's Via Appia show only a fraction achieved this. Often, after decades of service, the Sena itself was a microcosm of their invisibility. As guests laughed and debated, slaves stood silently, refilling goblets or sweeping crumbs, their presence ignored unless they faltered. You might notice a young girl, barely a teenager, carrying a heavy tray, her eyes scanning for the steward's nod of approval. Her life, like many, was shaped by routine: rise, work, sleep, repeat. Yet, within this monotony, there were flickers of agency. Some slaves, particularly those with skills like literacy, subtly influenced their households, managing accounts or teaching children. As noted in Suetonius' accounts of elite households, these moments of influence, though fleeting, hinted at their humanity, suppressed but never erased. As the Senna winds down and the villa grows quiet, you sense the undercurrent of tension. How long could these slaves suppress their individuality, their memories of lost homes? Could the bonds they formed in secret become the seeds of something bolder? The villa is silent now, the guests departed, and the slaves retreat to their quarters, a dim, airless room beneath the grand halls. The question of whether their quiet bonds could spark something greater hangs heavy, and here, in the stillness, you see the limits and legacies of their existence. These household slaves, though bound by chains and routine, were not mere cogs. Their resilience and subtle defiance left marks on Rome's history, faint but enduring. You might feel the weight of their lives, each day a testament to survival in a world that sought to erase them. Most slaves never escaped their roles, their lives consumed by the endless cycle of service. Historical evidence, like tombstone inscriptions from Rome's necropolis, reveals lifespans often cut short. Many died in their 20s or 30s, worn out by labor or disease. Yet, some found ways to carve out meaning. You can imagine a slave scribe, perhaps a Greek named Callistus, copying scrolls by lamplight, his work preserving knowledge even as his own story faded. Others, like the Nutrix, who nursed patrician children, left emotional imprints, their care shaping future senators, as hinted in Cicero's letters praising his son's nurse. These connections, though unequal, were threads of influence, weaving slaves into the fabric of Roman life, despite their legal invisibility. Resistance, when it occurred, was rarely grand. Unlike the dramatic revolts of Sicily, household slaves acted in subtler ways. A deliberate slowdown in work, a hidden stash of food, or whispered tales of freedom shared in the dark. The Lex Alia Sensia 04 CE shows Rome's awareness of this undercurrent, imposing stricter rules on manumission to curb unrest. Yet, manumission remained a faint hope. Freed slaves, or liberti, like the poet Horace's father, could rise to modest prominence, their success a rare beacon for others. Funerary inscriptions from the columbaria of Livia reveal freedmen who became merchants or artisans, their wealth funding tombs that proclaimed their hard-won status. For most, though, freedom was a dream deferred, their lives spent in service, their names lost to history. The legacy of these slaves ripples into our world. Their labor built Rome's grandeur, the villas. Their resilience in enduring and occasionally defying their lot speaks to a universal human spirit. You might reflect on how their invisibility mirrors modern systems of labor, where unseen workers sustain our comforts. The Roman household, with its polished surfaces and hidden suffering, was a microcosm of an empire that thrived on exploitation yet sowed the seeds of its own fragility. By the 4th century CE, as slavery waned with Rome's decline, the structures they built endured, but so did the questions of justice they raised. As you step away from this villa, consider the cost of Rome's splendor. What does it mean to build a civilization on the backs of the silenced? And how do their quiet acts of endurance challenge us to see the unseen in our own time? Story 3. Beneath the Earth. The grueling life in Roman mines. Picture yourself descending into the darkness of a Roman mine. The air growing thick with dust and the faint metallic temps of ore. The flickering light of oil lamps casts shadows on rough-hewn walls, revealing the hunched figures of slaves toiling in endless labor. You're in one of the many mines that fueled Rome's wealth, from the silver veins of Hispania to the gold deposits of Dacia. These subterranean worlds were the grim engines of empire, where slaves, often forgotten by history, endured conditions that tested the limits of human survival. As you navigate this oppressive space, you feel the weight of the earth above and the crushing reality of lives spent beneath it. In the 1st century BCE, Rome's expansion relied heavily on its mines. Historical records, like those from Strabo's geography, describe vast operations in regions like Lorien in Greece or Las Majulas in Spain, where slaves extracted silver, gold, and lead to mint coins and craft luxuries. Most miners were war captives or condemned criminals, known as damnati ad matelos, sentenced to the mines. You might imagine a young man from Carthage, his wrists scarred from chains, wielding a pickaxe in suffocating tunnels. The work was relentless. 12-hour shifts, hacking at rock with iron tools, as described by Pliny the Elder. The air was choked with dust, and cave-ins were a constant threat. Archaeological evidence from Rio Tinto mines shows skeletons with broken bones, testament to the dangers. Living conditions were brutal. Slaves slept in cramped barracks near mine entrances, often chained to prevent escape. As noted in Diodorus Siculus' accounts of Egyptian mines, their diet was minimal stale bread, water, and occasional scraps of salted fish, barely enough to sustain their grueling labor. Clothing was rudimentary, tattered tunics and straw sandals that wore out quickly against jagged rocks. You can envision the exhaustion in their faces, illuminated only by the dim glow of lamps fueled by rancid oil. Health deteriorated rapidly. Silicosis from inhaling dust led to coughing fits, while malnutrition weakened bodies already strained by heavy loads. Medical care was non-existent. A broken leg or fever often meant death, as slaves were replaceable commodities. The mines were not just workplaces, but symbols of Rome's ruthless efficiency. Overseers, often freedmen or lower-class citizens, enforced quotas with whips, as seen in inscriptions detailing production targets. Slaves carried baskets of ore up narrow shafts, their backs bent under weights that could exceed 50 pounds. The empire's appetite for metals was insatiable. Silver for denarii, lead for pipes, gold for statues. Slaves paid the price. Yet, amidst this toil, you might notice fleeting moments of humanity, a shared glance between workers, a muttered curse in a native tongue. These men and women, stripped of freedom, clung to fragments of their past. As you linger in this underworld, you wonder, how could anyone endure such relentless suffering? What kept these slaves from surrendering to despair in the bowels of the earth? You're deeper now in the mine's labyrinth, where the air grows heavier, and the rhythmic clink of pickaxes echoes like a heartbeat of despair. The question of what kept slaves from succumbing to hopelessness lingers. And here, in the suffocating tunnels, you see glimpses of their resilience. these were not just bodies at work. They were individuals with memories, fears, and faint hopes, navigating a world designed to crush them. The Roman mines were a crucible of suffering, but also a stage for the quiet, stubborn endurance of the human spirit. The daily grind was unforgiving. Slaves worked in teams, as described by ancient sources like Vitruvius, using crude tools to chip away at rock faces. Some operated water wheels to drain flooded shafts, their bodies drenched and shivering in cold groundwater. Others hauled or through tunnels so narrow they had to crawl, their knees bloodied by sharp stones. Archaeological finds from mines like those in Britannia reveal worn tools and skeletal remains with signs of repetitive stress. Injuries: shoulders dislocated, spines curved from years of strain. You might picture a Dacian slave, his hands blistered, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow, only to be lashed by an overseer for slowing production. These overseers, often former slaves themselves, were tasked with meeting quotas set by distant mine owners, their own survival tied to the slaves' output. Survival strategies emerged in small, defiant acts. Slaves shared water from their meager rations, a gesture of solidarity in a world that pitted them against each other. Some whispered stories of their homeland's Thracian hills or Numidian deserts, preserving identities the Romans sought to erase. Religious tokens, like small amulets found in mining sites, suggest clandestine prayers to gods of their ancestors, offering solace in the dark. Escape was rare. The damnati were often branded or tattooed, as noted in legal texts like the Digest, making flight futile. Yet, some risked it, forming runaway bands that hid in forests, as recorded in Tacitus' accounts of provincial unrest. These attempts, though often doomed, spoke to a refusal to accept their fate entirely. The mine's output was staggering. Strabo notes, Laurian produced enough silver to fund Athens' fleet before Rome's conquest, but the human cost was incalculable. Slaves were expendable. When one fell, another was sent from the markets. You might imagine the despair of a mother sentenced for a petty crime, working alongside her teenage son, both knowing their lives would likely end here. Yet, the mines also fostered a grim camaraderie. Workers relied on each other to survive collapses or to meet quotas that spared them punishment. These bonds, fragile as they were, hinted at a collective strength that Rome feared. As the lamps flicker and the dust settles, you sense a spark beneath the surface. Could these small acts of defiance, shared water, whispered stories grow into something more? What would it take for the enslaved to turn their endurance into rebellion? You stand now at the mine's entrance, where the faint light of dawn barely reaches the slaves emerging from their shifts, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow. The question of whether their quiet defiance could spark rebellion hangs in the air. And here, at the edge of this underworld, you see the limits of their resistance and the enduring impact of their labor. The Roman mines were a brutal necessity, their output gilding the empire's grandeur. But the slaves who toiled within left a legacy of resilience that outlasted the rocks they broke. Rebellion in the mines was rare but not unknown. The Second Servile War, 104 to 100 BCE, in Sicily, described by Diodorus Siculus, saw miners among the rebels, their knowledge of tunnels aiding guerrilla tactics. You might imagine a group of slaves, led by someone like Salvius, a flute player turned rebel, using stolen tools to sabotage equipment or block shafts. These uprisings, though crushed with brutal efficiency, thousands crucified or returned to chain-sent tremors through Rome's elite. Laws like the Lex Fabia, targeting slave abductions, reflect the empire's fear of organized resistance. Most miners, however, lacked the means for revolt. Branded, malnourished, and isolated, their defiance remained small, a slowed pace, a hidden tool, or a shared prayer. As evidenced by votive offerings found in Dacian mines, the mines' true legacy was their output. Silver from Hispania-funded legions, gold from Dacia adorned Trajan's forum as seen in reliefs on his column. Yet this wealth came at a horrific cost. Biogeological studies of mining sites reveal slaves' lifespans rarely exceeded 30 years. Their bodies ravaged by dust and exhaustion. You might picture a young woman, her lungs scarred by silica, collapsing under a load. Her name unrecorded, but her labor etched into Rome's coins. Manumission was almost non-existent here. Unlike household slaves, miners were rarely freed, their value tied solely to their output. Those who survived long enough might become overseers, but inscriptions from mines like Algestral show these were exceptions, not the rule. The mines shaped Rome's rise and fall. Their wealth sustained expansion, but over-reliance on slave labor stifled innovation. As historians like Finlay argue, by the 3rd century CE, as invasions and economic strain grew, mines faltered, and with them, Rome's power. The slaves' suffering, though, left a deeper mark. Their endurance seen in the care they took to bury fallen comrades, as found in mass graves, speaks to a humanity that no chain could erase. You might reflect on how their labor echoes in our world. The metals they mined built aqueducts still standing, while their struggles remind us of the human cost behind wealth. As you leave this mine, consider the shadows it casts. What does it mean to build an empire on such suffering? And how do the silent resilience of these slaves challenge us to confront the hidden costs of our own progress? Story for fields of endless labor. Slaves on the vast latifundior, standing on the edge of a vast Roman latifundium, a sprawling agricultural estate stretching across the sun-scorched plains of Sicily or southern Italy. The air hums with the buzz of cicadas and the distant clink of tools as slaves toil under an unforgiving sky. These estates, the backbone of Rome's food supply, were worked by countless enslaved men and women whose labor fed the empires, cities, and armies. As you survey the endless rows of wheat, olive groves, and vineyards, you sense the weight of lives bound to the soil, their stories buried beneath the harvest. This is the world of the latifundia, where human resilience was tested daily in the grind of rural servitude. By the 2nd century BCE, latifundia had transformed Roman agriculture, consolidating small farms into massive estates owned by the elite. Ancient sources like Cato, the Elders de Agricultura, describe these operations as highly organized, relying on slave labor to maximize profit. Most slaves were war captives, Gauls, Greeks, or Numidians, brought from Rome's conquests, as noted in Livy's histories. You might picture a man, once a farmer in his native land, now yoked to a plow alongside oxen, his back scarred from the overseer's whip. Tasks varied: planting grain, pruning vines, or pressing olives, each requiring relentless effort. The workday began at dawn and ended at dusk, with only brief pauses for water or a handful of barley, as Columella's treatises detail. Living conditions were stark. Slaves were housed in Ergastula underground barracks with barred windows, described by Diodorus Siculus as prison-like. These damp, crowded spaces offered little rest. Straw mats were their beds, and chains often bound those deemed rebellious. Clothing was minimal coarse tunics that chafed against sunburned skin. Food was calculated for survival: porridge, bread, and occasional salted fish, barely enough to fuel their labor. Disease was rampant. Malaria and dysentery, common in the marshy lowlands, claimed many, as archaeological finds of mass graves near Sicilian estates confirm. You can almost hear the groans of exhaustion as slaves trudged back to their quarters, their bodies aching from hauling baskets or digging irrigation ditches. The latifundia were engines of efficiency, producing grain for Rome's bread dole and wine for its feasts. Overseers, often slaves themselves, enforced strict quotas, their authority backed by brutal punishments, flogging or branding for failing to meet targets, as seen in legal texts like the Digest. Yet, amidst this toil, you notice flickers of humanity: a slave sharing a sip of water, or a mother humming a lullaby from her lost homeland to soothe a child born into bondage. These estates, while symbols of Rome's wealth, were also tinderboxes of discontent, their scale amplifying the potential for unrest. As you walk these fields, you wonder, how did these slaves find the strength to endure such endless labor? What simmered beneath their bowed heads as they worked the land that fed an empire? The sun climbs higher over the latifundium, its heat bearing down on slaves bent over rows of wheat or trudging through vineyards. The question of what stirred beneath their toil lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their labor, you glimpse the fragile balance of survival and defiance. These fields were not just places of work, but battlegrounds of endurance, where slaves navigated a system designed to extract every ounce of their strength. You can feel the tension in their movements, each swing of a hoe or twist of a vine a testament to resilience in the face of relentless oppression. Work on the latifundia was divided with precision, as outlined in Veros de Re Rustica. Men plowed fields or harvested olives, their muscles straining under the weight of tools and baskets. Women and children often gleaned leftover grain or carried water, their smaller frames no less burdened. You might picture a woman from Thrace, her hands rough from years of picking fruit, pausing to shield her eyes from the sun, only to be prodded by an overseer's stick. These overseers, often promoted slaves, were tasked with maximizing output, their whips a constant threat. Inscriptions from estates in Campania detail quotas. A slave might be expected to harvest 100 pounds of grapes daily or plow an acre before dusk. Failure meant punishment, lashings, or reduced rations, as recorded in the Corpus Juris Civilis. Survival required cunning. Slaves learned to pace their work to avoid exhaustion, sharing tricks to ease the strain, like wrapping cloth around blistered hands. Some hoarded small caches of grain hidden in the folds of their tunics. As archaeological evidence from Sicilian estates suggests, these acts of quiet resistance, stealing food feigning illness, or breaking tools were risky but vital. You can imagine whispered conversations in the ergastula at night, where slaves shared stories of their lost homes, keeping their identities alive. Religious practices persisted in secret. Small clay figurines found in rural sites hint at offerings to deities like Ceres, a flicker of hope in a world of despair. The latifundious scale made control challenging. Unlike household slaves, those in the fields were often far from their masters, overseen by intermediaries who could be bribed or evaded. Runaway slaves, known as fugitivi, formed bands in the hills, as Tacitus notes in his accounts of rural unrest. These groups raided estates, stealing supplies or freeing others, though most were hunted down by Roman patrols. The First Servile War, 135–132 BCE in Sicily, sparked on such estates, showed the potential for rebellion, with slaves seizing tools as weapons. Rome responded with brutal force, but the unrest revealed the system's fragility. As the day fades and the slaves trudge back to their barracks, you sense a growing undercurrent. Could these small acts of defiance, hidden grain, whispered plants ignite a larger spark? What would it take for these fields to become a battleground, not just of labor, but of revolt? Night has fallen over the latifundium, the fields now silent save for the rustle of wind through olive trees. The slaves huddle in their ergastula, their bodies weary but minds alive with the question of whether their defiance could become revolt. Here, in the stillness, you see the culmination of their struggle and the lasting impact of their labor. The latifundia fed Rome, but at a cost that sowed seeds of both rebellion and decline. Their legacy etched into the empire's rise and fall. The First Servile War, sparked in 135 BCE, was a stark reminder of the latifundia's volatility. Diodorus Siculus recounts how slaves, led by Eunice, seized Sicilian estates, turning plows into weapons. You might imagine a slave, his hands calloused from years of sowing, now wielding a scythe against his overseer. The rebellion briefly captured towns, but Rome's legions crushed it, crucifying thousands along the Via Appia, as Appian's histories describe. Smaller acts of resistance persisted, sabotaged crops, stolen tools, or secret gatherings, as evidenced by archaeological finds of hidden caches. These acts, though often futile, revealed a spirit unbroken by chains. The Lex Pompei of 89 BCE, restricting slave movements, shows Rome's fear of this undercurrent. Most slaves, however, faced a grimmer fate. Life expectancy was low. Skeletal remains from estates reveal malnutrition and injuries from overwork. You might picture a boy born into slavery, collapsing under a load of grain, his life unrecorded, but his labor feeding Rome's masses. Manumission was rare in the fields, unlike in households. Inscriptions from rural necropolis show few freedmen, as the latifundia's owners saw slaves as tools, not potential citizens. Yet, some left traces of their humanity. Crude carvings of names or symbols on tools found in excavations suggest a quiet claim to identity. The latifundia's legacy is complex. They produced the grain that sustained Rome's unknowna, the free bread dole that kept the city stable, as noted in Pliny the Elder's works. But their reliance on slave labor stifled agricultural innovation, contributing to economic stagnation by the 3rd century CE, as historians like Rostovtsev argue. The rebellions they sparked, though suppressed, foreshadowed later uprisings, like Spartacus in 73 BCE, and echoed in modern struggles against exploitation. You might reflect on how these fields, so vital to Rome's power, mirror today's systems of labor, where unseen workers sustain global economies. The slaves' endurance, their shared songs, their hidden defiance, speaks to a resilience that outlasted their chains. As you leave these fields, consider their shadow over history. What does it mean to feed an empire on the backs of the enslaved? And how do their silent struggles urge us to question the foundations of our own prosperity? Story 5. The gladiator's routine, training, fights, and forgotten lives here, standing at the edge of a dusty training ground. The Ludus Magnus, Rome's largest gladiator school, where the clash of wooden swords and the shouts of trainers fill the air. The Colosseum looms nearby, its shadow a reminder of the brutal spectacles that await. Here, enslaved men gladiators honed their skills, their lives shaped by a relentless routine of training and survival. These were not just fighters, but captives, often war prisoners or condemned slaves, whose existence was a strange mix of discipline and despair. As you watch them drill under the midday suns, you feel the weight of their precarious lives, caught between the promise of glory and the certainty of violence. In the 1st century CE, gladiators were a cornerstone of Roman entertainment, as described by Suetonius and Tacitus. Many were drawn from conquered lands, Thracians, Gauls, or Dacians chosen for their strength or fighting prowess. You might picture a young Thracian captured after a Roman victory, now sweating in the arena's training yard, learning to wield a The Ludus was a world of strict regimentation. Mornings began with calisthenics and mock combat, using wooden weapons to build muscle and precision. As detailed in inscriptions from Pompey's gladiator barracks, trainers, or doctors, often former gladiators, drilled them in specific roles: Murmello with shield and sword, Resiarius with net and trident, each requiring unique skills. Life in the Ludus was grueling but structured. Slaves slept in small barred cells, their straw pallets offering little comfort, as archaeological finds from the Ludus Magnus reveal. Their diet was surprisingly robust: barley porridge, beans, and occasional meat to build strength, earning them the nickname Horderi barleymen per Pliny the Elder. Yet, injuries were common. Sparring accidents or overexertion left scars, and basic medical care, like bandages or cauterization, was provided only to keep them fighting, as noted in Galen's medical texts. Discipline was harsh. A misstep in training could mean a whip slash or reduced rations. As recorded in the digest, gladiators were both valued and expendable. Successful fighters brought wealth to their lanista trainer owner, yet their lives hung on the crowd's whims. You might notice a quiet camaraderie among them, sharing tips on footwork or binding each other's wounds, a flicker of humanity in a brutal system. Some, like the Thracian Spartacus, carried memories of freedom, their spirits unbroken despite their chains. The Ludus was a microcosm of Rome's contradictions. Slaves trained to entertain, their skills celebrated, but their lives cheap. As you watch these men train, their muscles straining under the watchful eyes of their doctors, you wonder what drove them to endure this punishing routine. How did they balance the hope of survival with the specter of death in the arena? The training ground is quieter now, as the gladiators break for a brief meal under the watchful gaze of their doctors. The question of what drove them to endure lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their daily grind, you see the complex interplay of fear, hope, and defiance that kept them going. The ludus was not just a school for combat, but a crucible where slaves forged resilience, navigating a system that demanded both their skill and their submission. You can sense the tension in their glances, each man weighing his odds of surviving the next fight. Training was relentless, designed to transform captives into spectacles. Mornings were spent sparring, afternoons perfecting techniques against wooden posts called poly, as described in Juvenile's satires. You might picture a Retiarius, his net tangled from practice, sweating as he learns to counter a secutor's charge. The doctors were unforgiving, correcting errors with shouts or blows, their own survival tied to their trainees' success. Archaeological evidence from Ephesus Gladiator Cemetery shows fractures and healed wounds, proof of the toll this training took. Yet, gladiators were also taught showmanship, crowd-pleasing flourishes. Like a dramatic Paris-Saint survival often depended on applause. As Martial's epigrams note, a popular fighter might earn a reprieve, signaled by the crowd's thumbs, dash up beyond the arena. Life in the ludus fostered a fragile camaraderie. Gladiators formed bonds, sharing stories of their homelands or strategies for survival. As graffiti from Pompey's barracks suggest, you can imagine a Gaul teaching a younger slave to wrap his hands to prevent blisters, a small act of solidarity. Yet, trust was precarious. Some betrayed comrades for extra rations or favor, as seen in legal records of informers. The promise of manumission-fueled hope victory in the arena could earn freedom, as with the gladiator Flamma, who won the Rudy's wooden sword of liberty 4 times per his Syrian tombstone. But such cases were rare. Most faced death or disability long before freedom. The gladiator's life was a paradox, trained to kill, yet at the mercy of others. Their value lay in their performance, yet they were property, branded or collared, as noted in the Corpus Juris Civilis. Some embraced the role, gaining fame. Graffiti in Rome praises fighters like Celadus, the ladies' man, but fame came at a cost. You might see a veteran gladiator, his body scarred, eyeing the Colosseum with dread, knowing each fight could be his last. The ludus was a pressure cooker, where the promise of glory clashed with the reality of servitude. As the gladiators returned to training, their swords clashing under the fading light, you sense a restless energy. Could the bonds they forged, or the hope of freedom, push them beyond mere survival? What might happen if their skills, honed for Rome's amusement, were turned against their masters? Night has fallen over the Ludus Magnus, the training ground silent, save for the distant roar of Rome's crowds. The gladiators rest in their cells, their bodies bruised, but spirits wrestling with the question of whether their skills could defy their chains. Here, in the quiet, you see the culmination of their lives, some ending in blood-soaked sand, others in fleeting moments of freedom. The gladiators' routine, built on discipline and violence, shaped not just their fate, but Rome's spectacle-driven culture, leaving a legacy of resilience and rebellion. The arena was the ultimate test. Fights, staged during festivals like the Ludi Romani, drew thousands, as described by Dio Cassius. You might imagine a Murmillo, his helmet gleaming, facing a Ricciarius in the Colosseum, the crowd's cheers deafening. Most bouts were not to the death sponsor's valued, trained fighters, but injuries were severe, as skeletal remains from gladiator cemeteries show, with sword cuts and shattered bones. A defeated gladiator's fate rested on the editor's signal, often swayed by the crowd. Survival meant another fight. Death meant anonymity, with unmarked graves for most per archaeological records. Yet some, like the gladiator Priscus, won fame, their names etched in mosaics for epic duels, as martial recounts. Rebellion was the ultimate defiance. The Third Servile War, 7371 BCE, led by Spartacus, began in a Capuan ludus, where gladiators used their training to break free, as Plutarch describes. You can picture them seizing kitchen knives and training weapons, their skills turning Rome's spectacle against it. Though crushed, with 6,000 crucified, their revolt shook the empire, prompting laws like the Lex Cornelia to tighten control over gladiators. Most never rebelled, their resistance subtler, a deliberate stumble in training, or a whispered oath of loyalty to comrades. As graffiti from Pompeii hint, manumission remained a distant hope. Fighters like Flamma, freed after victories, were outliers. Their rudies a rare prize. The gladiator's legacy endures in Rome's ruins and our imagination. Their fights funded public works like the Colosseum, and their courage captivated poets like Juvenal. Yet, their lives reveal Rome's moral cost, a society that glorified violence while dehumanizing its performers. By the 4th century CE, as Christianity rose, gladiatorial games waned. Banned by Constantine in 325 CE, though smaller shows persisted, you might reflect on how their story mirrors modern spectacles, where entertainers risk all for fleeting fame. The gladiators' resilience their bonds, their defiance speaks to a humanity that survived even the arena's brutality. As you leave the ludus, consider their forgotten lives. What does it mean to cheer for those forced to fight? And how do their struggles challenge us to see the humanity behind today's spectacles? Story 6. Women in Chains. Bearing burdens in domestic and public spheres, standing in the heart of a bustling Roman household, where the clatter of pots and the soft hum of a loom fill the air. Beyond the elegant atrium, in the shadows of the domus, or the public spaces of the city, enslaved women labor tirelessly, their lives woven into the fabric of Rome's daily existence. These women, often overlooked by history, carried burdens both domestic and public, their work essential yet invisible. As you move through this world, you feel the weight of their tasks, grinding grain, weaving cloth, or serving in the streets each moment, a testament to their endurance in a society that denied them freedom. In the 1st century BCE, enslaved women were a vital part of Roman society, making up a significant portion of the slave population, as noted in Appian's histories. Captured from conquered lands like Greece, Syria, or Gaul, they were thrust into roles dictated by their master's needs. In wealthier households, women served as ancilla, performing domestic tasks. You might picture a young Syrian woman, her hands calloused, grinding spelt in the Kalina kitchen before dawn, her movements mechanical to avoid the overseer's rod. Others worked as ornatresses, dressing their mistress's hair with intricate pins, or as nutresses, nursing patrician children. as described in Cicero's letters. In public, women slaves cleaned temples, carried goods in markets, or worked in Papine taverns, their labor fueling Rome's urban pulse. Their lives were defined by relentless routine. Domestic slaves rose early, their days filled with repetitive tasks, kneading dough, scrubbing floors, or spinning wool, as detailed in Columella's treatises. Their diet was sparse barley porridge, water, and table scraps served in cramped quarters called ergastula, where they slept on straw mats per Diodorus Siculus. Clothing was minimal, often a single tunic, worn thin by labor. In public roles, women faced additional hardships. Market workers endured long hours under the sun, while those in taverns faced harassment. As Juvenile's satires hint, health was precarious. Childbirth, common among enslaved women, was dangerous, with little medical care. As archaeological records of female slave burials show, punishment was ever present. A spilled jar or a poorly woven cloth could earn lashes or confinement, as legal texts, like the Digest, record. Yet, these women were indispensable. Their work sustained households and public spaces, their skills from weaving to childcare propping up Rome's elite. You might notice small acts of resilience, a whispered lullaby in a foreign tongue, or a shared glance of understanding between slaves. These women, stripped of autonomy, clung to fragments of their past, their labor a silent foundation of the empire. As you linger in this world of endless tasks, you wonder, how did these women cope with the weight of their burdens? What strength did they draw upon to endure, and what stirred in their hearts as they served in silence? The Roman household hums with activity as the day progresses, and you follow the enslaved women through their tasks, their movements swift yet burdened. The question of how they endured lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their labor, you see a delicate balance of survival, resilience, and quiet defiance. These women, whether in the domus or the streets, navigated a world that demanded their service while denying their humanity. You can sense the strength in their hands, worn from weaving or scrubbing, as they carve out small spaces of agency within their chains. In the household, roles were rigidly defined. The ancilla who ground grain might also clean the atrium, her day a blur of tasks, as Varro's writings on household management suggest. The ornatrix, skilled in braiding hair, worked under intense scrutiny, her mistakes inviting slaps, as Juvenile notes in his satires. Nutresses, nursing elite children, formed emotional bonds, yet their own children, if born, were often sold or raised as slaves, as inscriptions from the columbaria of Livia reveal. In public, women slaves faced harsher realities. Those in Papine served rowdy patrons, dodging unwanted advances, while market carriers hauled heavy baskets, their backs bent under loads. As depicted in Pompey's, you might picture a Gaulish woman, her arms aching, weaving through Rome's crowded forum, her eyes scanning for a moment's rest. Survival meant adaptation. Women shared knowledge how to ease a burn from the kitchen fire or soothe a child to avoid punishment, as archaeological finds of herbal remedies in slave quarters suggest. They formed fragile networks, whispering in native languages during rare breaks, preserving fragments of their identities. Some risked small rebellions, a deliberate snag in a woven cloth, or a slowed pace in the market. Acts noted in the digest as common enough to warrant punishment. Yet betrayal loomed. Informing on a fellow slave could earn favor, as legal records show. Manumission was a faint hope, more common for domestic slaves than public ones. A nutrix might be freed for loyalty, like one praised in a freedwoman's epitaph from Rome. But most faced lifelong servitude. The public sphere exposed women to Rome's gaze. Yet they remained invisible as individuals. In temples, they swept altars to gods they couldn't worship freely, their offerings hidden as small votive figurines found in ostia suggest. In taverns, they endured exploitation, some forced into prostitution, as Martial's epigrams grimly imply. These women were the unseen scaffolding of Rome's grandeur, their labor enabling the elite's leisure. Yet their resilience shone through in quiet ways, a lullaby sung to a patrician child, a shared meal in the Iargos Tula. As the day wanes and the women retreat to their quarters, you sense a simmering tension. Could these small acts of defiance, these whispered bonds, grow into something greater? What might push these women to challenge the chains that bound them? Night has settled over the Roman domus, the household quiet except for the faint creak of a loom or the soft cries of a child in the slave quarters. The question of whether these women's defiance could spark change lingers. And here, in the stillness, you see the limits of their resistance and the profound impact of their labor. Enslaved women, in homes and public spaces, were the unseen pillars of Rome, their endurance shaping an empire, while their struggles hinted at its fragility. Their lives, though rarely recorded, left traces that echo through history. Most enslaved women never escaped their chains. Domestic slaves faced lifelong toil, their bodies worn by repetitive tasks grinding, weaving, nursing as skeletal remains from Rome's necropolis show, with signs of arthritis and malnutrition. In public roles, the toll was heavier. Women in popinae or markets faced physical and social abuse, their lives often cut short, as burial records from Ostia indicate. Yet their work was vital. They wove the tunics that clothed Rome, prepared the bread that fed its citizens, and raised its future leaders, as Cicero's praise for his son's Nutrix suggests. You might imagine a woman, once a weaver in Greece, now teaching a young slave to spin wool, passing on skills that sustained both survival and identity. Resistance was subtle but persistent. A deliberate flaw in a garment or a slowed step in the market, noted in the digest, were acts of defiance. Though risky punishments ranged from flogging to sale to harsher masters, some women joined larger rebellions, like the Servile Wars, though their roles were less documented than men's, as Diodorus Siculus accounts imply. Manumission offered hope, particularly for nutresses or ornatresses, whose closeness to the elite could earn freedom, as seen in inscriptions honoring freedwomen like a former slave of Livia. Yet most remained bound, their children born into slavery, perpetuating the cycle. As legal texts like the Lex Alea Sensia confirm, their legacy is woven into Rome's foundations. The cloth they spun, the children they raised, and the public spaces they maintained underpinned the empire's stability. As Pliny the Elder's descriptions of urban life suggest, yet their exploitation sowed seeds of unrest, contributing to economic strains by the 3rd century CE, as historians like Finlay note. Their resilience seen in shared songs or hidden rituals, like votive offerings found in slave quarters, speaks to a humanity that endured despite oppression. You might reflect on how their story mirrors modern labor systems, where women's unseen work often sustains society. As you leave this world of silent labor, consider the cost of Rome's grandeur. What does it mean to build a civilization on the toil of those denied freedom? And how do these women's quiet strengths challenge us to honor the invisible in our own time? Story 7. Children of Bondage. Growing up without freedom, you are standing in the dim corner of a Roman villa's slave quarters, where the faint cry of a child pierces the stillness. The air is heavy with the scent of straw and sweat, and you see young faces, children born into slavery, moving through their tasks with small, practiced hands. These verni, as the Romans called children born to enslaved mothers, grew up in a world where freedom was a distant concept, their lives shaped by labor and submission from their earliest years. As you watch them carry water or sweep floors, you feel the weight of a childhood defined not by play but by servitude. Their small figures, a poignant reminder of Rome's unyielding system in the 1st century BCE. Slave children were a significant part of Rome's workforce, as noted in Appian's histories. Born in households, fields, or mines, they were the property of their mother's master, their status fixed at birth by the lex alea sensia. You might picture a girl no older than 7, her hair tied back, carrying a basket of laundry in a patrician's domus. Her mother, perhaps a kitchen slave, works nearby, their bond strained by the constant threat of separation through sale, as inscriptions from Pompeii's slave markets reveal. Children worked alongside adults, their tasks scaled to their size, fetching tools, cleaning, or tending animals on latifundia, as Columella's treatises describe. Their labor was cheap, their small bodies filling gaps in the empire's economy. Life for these children was harsh. They slept in cramped ergastula on straw mats beside their mothers, as Diodorus Siculus notes. Their diet was meager barley porridge or bread crusts barely enough to sustain growth, leading to stunted frames, as skeletal remains from rural estates show. Clothing was minimal, often hand-me-down tunics, patched and thin. Education was rare, though some urban verni learned basic literacy to serve as messengers or scribes. As Suetonius mentions in accounts of elite households, discipline was severe. A spilled jug or a slow task could earn a beating, as the digest records. You might see a boy, his eyes wary, dodging an overseer's whip as he scrubs a mosaic floor. Despite their burdens, these children found moments of humanity. They played in fleeting breaks, kicking stones or mimicking their elders' tasks, as graffiti from Ostia's slave quarters suggest. Mothers whispered stories of distant homelands, preserving fragments of identity. Yet, their vulnerability was stark. Many were sold as young as 5, separated from family, as market records from Rome indicate. These children were Rome's future slaves, their lives a cycle of labor with little hope of freedom. As you watch these small figures toil, you wonder, how did these children find resilience in a world that stole their youth? What dreams, if any, flickered in their hearts as they grew up in chains? The day wears on in the Roman villa, and you follow the verni as they move through their tasks, their small hands busy with chores far beyond their years. The question of their resilience lingers, and here, in the hum of their labor, you see glimpses of how these children survived a world that saw them as property. Their lives were a delicate dance of obedience and subtle defiance. Their spirits shaped by the harsh realities of slavery, yet tempered by moments of connection and hope. You can feel the weight of their small shoulders, carrying burdens no child should bear. Tasks for slave children were relentless, tailored to their size, but no less demanding. In rural latifundia, boys and girls herded goats or gathered fallen olives, their fingers nimble but often bloodied, as Veros de Re Rustica describes. In urban households, they polished silver or carried messages through crowded streets, dodging carts and pedestrians, as noted in Juvenal's satires. You might picture a boy, barely 10, scurrying to deliver a wax tablet, his heart racing to avoid punishment. Overseers, often slaves themselves, enforced strict discipline, with beatings for errors as small as a dropped tool, per the Corpus Juris Civilis. Their days stretched from dawn to dusk, with brief pauses for meager meals, often just a crust shared with others in the ergastula. Survival demanded ingenuity. Children learned to anticipate their master's moods, avoiding punishment by perfecting tasks or feigning diligence. You might imagine a girl, her eyes sharp, hiding a broken dish to spare a beating, a small act of cunning. They formed bonds with each other, sharing whispered games or stories of their mothers. Homeland tales of Syrian rivers or Thracian hills, as graffiti from Pompeii's slave quarters suggest. These connections were lifelines, though fragile. Betrayal for extra food was a risk, as legal records of informers show. Some children, especially in elite households, gained skills like reading or accounting, increasing their value but not their freedom. As Suetonius notes of young scribes, manumission was a distant dream. Unlike some adult slaves, children rarely earned freedom, their labor too cheap to warrant release, as inscriptions from Rome's necropolis indicate. Yet, hope persisted, often tied to their mother's whispered promises or rare stories of freed Verni, like the freedwoman Claudia, noted in a Roman epitaph. The constant threat of sale-loom children were often separated from parents to break bonds, as market records from Ostia reveal. Despite this, their small acts of resistance, stealing a fig, carving a name on a wall, hinted at a spirit unbroken by chains. As the children settle into their cramped quarters, their voices hushed, you sense a quiet strength. Could these fleeting moments of defiance, these whispered dreams, grow into something more? What might push these young souls to challenge the system that bound them? Nightcloaks, the Roman villa, and the Verni hoddle in their ergastula, their small bodies curled on straw mats. The question of whether their defiance could challenge their chains lingers. And here, in the quiet, you see the limits of their resistance and the enduring impact of their lives. These children, born into bondage, were the unseen future of Rome's slave system, their labor sustaining an empire, while their resilience hinted at its fragility. Their stories, though rarely told, are etched into the foundations of the world they helped build. Most Verni faced a lifetime of servitude. Their small size made them valuable for tasks like cleaning tight spaces or tending animals, but it also marked them as disposable. as archaeological evidence of child burials, with signs of malnutrition and injury reveals. You might picture a girl, her hands worn from spinning wool, growing into the same tasks as her mother, her life a cycle of labor. Some, trained as scribes or messengers, gained skills that made them prized. As Suetonius notes of young slaves in elite households. Yet, manumission was rare. Inscriptions from Rome's Columbaria show few verney freed, their youth making them less likely to earn the loyalty or wealth needed for liberty. Separation from family was common. Children sold to distant estates or mines, as market records from Ostia confirm, leaving emotional scars. Resistance was subtle but vital. A hidden toy carved from wood or a whispered song found in slave quarters, artifacts, suggests children clung to moments of joy. Some joined their elders in small rebellions, spilling grain or slowing works that digest records, minor infractions. Larger uprisings, like the Servile Wars, included young slaves, though their roles were less documented. Per Diodorus Sic. These acts, however small, showed a spirit that refused to be fully broken. You might imagine a boy, his eyes fierce, scratching his name into a wall, claiming an identity Rome denied him. The legacy of these children is profound. Their labor cleaning, fetching, or learning skills supported Rome's households, fields, and cities, as Pliny the Elder's accounts of urban life imply. Yet, their exploitation fed the empire's economic flaws. Reliance on cheap child labor stifled innovation, contributing to Rome's decline by the 3rd century CE. As historians like Rostovtsev argue, their resilience echoes in modern struggles against child labor, reminding us of the human cost behind prosperity. You might reflect on how their stolen childhoods built Rome's grandeur. Their names lost, but their work enduring in its aqueducts and forums. As you leave these quarters, consider the shadow of their lives. What does it mean to raise a generation in chains? And how do their quiet acts of defiance challenge us to protect the vulnerable in our own time? Story 8. Educated captives, scribes, tutors, and intellectual servitude are standing in the quiet study of a Roman villa, where the soft scratch of a stylus on wax tablets fills the air. Amid shelves of scrolls, an enslaved scribe, perhaps a Greek or Syrian, labors over accounts or copies texts. His mind sharp, but his freedom stolen. These educated captives, scribes, tutors, and accountants were the intellectual backbone of Rome's elite. Their knowledge harnessed to serve masters who valued their skills, but not their humanity. As you watch this scribe work by lamplight, you feel the weight of a life where intellect was both a gift and a chain. Their labor hidden behind Rome's grandeur. In the 1st century BCE, Rome's conquests, particularly in Greece and the Hellenistic East, brought a flood of educated slaves into the empire, as noted in Polybius' histories. Captured scholars, poets, and teachers were prized for their literacy and expertise. You might picture a Greek captive, once a philosopher in Athens, now a scriba, tallying a senator's expenses. These slaves served in elite households, public offices, or schools, their tasks ranging from copying legal documents to teaching Latin to patrician children. As Suetonius describes in accounts of Roman education, their work demanded precision. A misspelled word or miscalculation could earn a beating. Per the Digest, their lives were a paradox of privilege and oppression. Unlike field or mine slaves, educated captives often lived in better conditions, sleeping in modest rooms within the domus, eating slightly better food like bread and olives, as Columela's treatises suggest. Yet, their intellectual labor was relentless. Scribes worked long hours, their eyes strained by dim light, transcribing texts or managing accounts, as inscriptions from Pompey's archives show. Tutors, often called pedagogi, drilled young elites in rhetoric or geometry, their own knowledge used to elevate others. Clothing was simple, but functional tunics and sandals, yet they were marked as slaves, sometimes with collars, as legal records indicate. Their value lay in their minds, but this offered little security. Masters relied on their expertise, but distrusted their intellect, fearing rebellion, as Plutarch notes in tales of educated slaves plotting escapes. You might notice small acts of resilience, a scribe slipping a personal note into a margin, or a tutor teaching a slave child to read in secret. These captives, often from cultured societies, carried memories of freedom, their skills a reminder of lives lost to conquest. Their labor propped up Rome's bureaucracy and culture, yet they remained property, their voices silenced. As you linger in this study, you wonder, how did these educated slaves endure the tension between their minds and their chains? What hopes or defiance stirred within them as they served Rome's elite with their intellect? The villa's study grows dim as the scribe continues his work, the flicker of an oil lamp casting shadows on papyrus. The question of how these educated slaves endured lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their intellectual labor, you see a delicate balance of submission and subtle defiance. These captive scribes, tutors, and accountants navigated a world where their minds were prized, but their freedom was forfeit. You can sense the strain in their careful movements, each stroke of the stylus a testament to their resilience in a system that exploited their knowledge. Their tasks were varied but demanding. Scribes copied scrolls, from poetry to legal contracts, their accuracy vital to Rome's bureaucracy, as seen in the preserved records of Herculaneum. You might picture a Syrian scribe, his fingers cramped, transcribing Cicero's speeches, knowing his work would outlast him, but never bear his name. Tutors, or pedagogy, taught grammar, mathematics, or philosophy to young elites, their lessons shaping Rome's future leaders. As Quintilian's writings on education describe, accountants managed estate finances, balancing ledgers with precision, as inscriptions from Ostia's commercial archives show. Errors were costly. A miscalculation could lead to flogging or sale, as the Corpus Juris Civilis notes. Their days were long, often extending into the night, their eyes strained by poor light and endless text. Survival required both skill and caution. Educated slaves learned to anticipate their master's needs, crafting flawless documents or delivering lessons with deference. Yet, they found ways to preserve their identity. You might imagine a tutor, once a scholar in Alexandria, slipping Greek verses into a lesson, or a scribe hiding a personal mark in a ledger, as rare marginalia from Roman texts suggest. These acts were risky. Masters feared educated slaves' potential for rebellion, as Plutarch recounts tales of plots hatched in scriptoria. Some formed quiet networks, sharing knowledge or teaching other slaves to read in secret, as graffiti from Pompey's slave quarters hint, more attainable for these slaves than for laborers. A loyal scribe or tutor might earn freedom, like the freedman Livius, noted in a Roman epitaph for teaching Augustus' children. Yet most remained enslaved, their skills binding them to their masters, as legal texts like the Lex Alia Sentia confirm. Their lives were a paradox, valued for their minds, yet dehumanized as property. You might see a tutor, his face lined with fatigue, guiding a patrician boy through rhetoric, his own thoughts locked away. Their work underpinned Rome's culturates, literature, laws, and education, but their names were rarely recorded. As the lamp burns low and the scribe pauses, you sense a quiet tension. Could their intellect, so carefully harnessed, become a tool for defiance? What might happen if these educated captives turned their knowledge against their masters? The villa is silent now, the scribe's stylus still, as night cloaks the study. The question of whether their intellect could spark defiance lingers, and here, in the quiet, you see the limits and legacy of these educated captives. Their minds fueled Rome's bureaucracy, literature, and education. Yet their lives were bound by chains, their contributions erased from history. These scribes, tutors, and accountants were the unsung architects of an empire. Their resilience, a testament to the power of knowledge under oppression. Most educated slaves never escaped servitude. Their work copying laws, teaching oratory, or balancing accounts was critical. Yet they remained property, as the Corpus Juris Civilis underscores. You might picture a Greek tutor, his eyes weary, teaching a senator's son, while his own thoughts of Plato or Homer went unspoken. Their labor preserved texts like Virgil's Aeneid and managed estates that funded Rome's grandeur, as seen in Herculaneum's archives. Yet their lives were precarious. A master's whim could send them to harsher roles, as Plutarch notes of scholars sold to mines. Archaeological evidence, like worn stelae in slave quarters, shows their relentless task endurance. Their bodies marked by ice train and cramped hands. Resistance was subtle but profound. Some scribes altered records to aid fellow slaves, as rare accounts of falsified ledgers suggest. Tutors taught enslaved children in secret, passing on literacy, as graffiti from Ostia's slave quarters hint. These acts carried grave risks, flogging, or execution for defiance, per the digest. Yet, they showed a refusal to let their minds be fully owned. Manumission was more attainable here than in fields or mines. Freedmen, like Livius or Horace's father, a former scribe, rose to prominence, as epitaphs from Rome's Via Appia reveal. But most remained enslaved, their skills binding them to their masters. Their names lost to history. Their legacy is woven into Rome's cultural fabric. The scrolls they copied, the lessons they taught, and the accounts they kept underpinned the empire's stability, as Quintilian's praise of educated slaves implies. Yet, their exploitation exposed Rome's flaws. Reliance on captive intellect stifled free innovation, contributing to economic stagnation by the 3rd century CE, as Finlay argues. Their quiet defiance hidden notes shared knowledge echoes in modern struggles for intellectual freedom. You might reflect on how their work, though uncredited, shapes our understanding of Rome, from its laws to its literature. As you leave this study, consider the cost of a civilization built on captive minds. What does it mean to harness knowledge without granting freedom? And how do these slaves' silent contributions challenge us to value the unseen intellects of our own time? Where the air hums with the tap of hammers and the scrape of chisels, enslaved artisans, potters, and mosaists labor over intricate creations, their skilled hands shaping the beauty of Rome's villas, temples, and public squares. These craftsmen, often captured from distant lands, were the unsung artists behind the empire's splendor, their lives bound by chains yet marked by creativity. As you watch a potter mold clay or a mosaist set tiny tiles, you feel the tension of their existence. Their talent fueled Rome's glory, but their freedom was the price. In the 1st century BCE, Rome's expansion brought skilled artisans from Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor, as noted in Strabo's Geographica. These slaves were valued for their expertise in crafting everything from bronze statues to delicate glassware. You might picture a Greek potter, once a master in Corinth, now shaping amphorae in a Roman officina, his fingers steady despite the overseer's watchful eye. Their work adorned the empire, mosaics in Pompey's villas, iron tools for latifundia, or jewelry for the elite, as Pliny the Elder describes in his Naturalis Historia. Each piece required precision. A flawed pot or uneven tile could mean a whip's lash, as the Digest records. Life in the workshop was grueling. Artisans worked long hours, often in cramped, smoky spaces filled with the heat of kilns or forges. As archaeological finds from Ostia's workshops show, they slept in nearby ergastula on straw mats, their rest disturbed by the clank of chains, per Diodorus Siculus. Their diet was basic bread, olives, and watered wine enough to sustain their labor, but not their health, as skeletal remains reveal signs of repetitive strain. Clothing was practical but worn, tunics stained with clay or soot. Injuries were common. Burns from forges or cuts from tools left scars with minimal care provided. As Galen's medical texts suggest, these artisans were vital to Rome's aesthetic and economy. Their creations, symbols of wealth and power, yet they were seen as tools, their skill exploited without reward. You might notice small acts of defiance, a potter etching a hidden mark on a vase, or a blacksmith sharing a tool sharpening trick with a fellow slave. These captives carried memories of their craft's pride, their hands preserving traditions from lost homelands. Their work built Rome's enduring beauty, but their lives were spent in obscurity. As you linger in this workshop, you wonder, how did these artisans balance their creative pride with the weight of their servitude? What stirred in their hearts as they crafted beauty for an empire that enslaved them? The workshop pulses with activity as the day progresses, the clatter of tools blending with the low hum of slaves at work. The question of how artisans endured their servitude lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their craft, you see a delicate balance of skill, pride, and quiet resistance. These enslaved craftsmen, potters, smiths, and mosaists poured their expertise into Rome's splendor, yet their lives were defined by the chains that bound them. You can sense the tension in their steady hands, each creation a testament to their resilience in a system that exploited their talent. Their tasks demanded both artistry and endurance. Potters shaped clay into amphorae or fine tableware, their wheels spinning for hours, as seen in the kilns of Pompeii. Blacksmiths forged tools or decorative fittings, their arms aching from hammering, while mosaists pieced together intricate designs, their eyes strained by tiny tesserae per Vitruvius de Architectura. You might picture an Egyptian glassblower, his breath measured, crafting delicate vials for the elite, knowing a single crack could earn a beating. As the Corpus Juris Civilis notes, overseers enforced strict quotas, dozens of pots or tiles, daily leaving little room for error. Workshops were often hot and cramped, with poor ventilation, as archaeological evidence from Rome's Esquiline Hill shows, increasing the risk of burns or lung damage. Survival meant blending skill with caution. Artisans learned to perfect their craft to avoid punishment, yet they found ways to assert their identity. You might imagine a mosaist hiding a personal symbol in a floor design, or a potter whispering techniques to a younger slave, preserving traditions from their homeland. These acts were subtle rebellions, as rare workshop graffiti suggest, risking flogging or sale if discovered. Some formed bonds, sharing tools or food scraps, as finds of communal hearths in Ostia's workshops indicate. Yet, betrayal was a threat. Informing on a fellow slave could earn favor. Per legal records, manumission was a faint hope, more attainable for skilled artisans than field laborers. A master craftsman, like the freedman Verus, who crafted a noted statue, could earn freedom through exceptional work, as inscriptions from Rome's Via Appia show. But most remained enslaved, their talent tying them to their master's wealth. Their creations mosaics in the baths of Caracalla. Tools for Rome's legions were symbols of status, yet the artisans themselves were invisible, their names unrecorded. You might see a blacksmith, his face etched with fatigue, hammering a blade, his thoughts drifting to a lost forge in Syria. As the workshop's din fades with the setting sun, you sense a simmering defiance. Could the pride in their craft, or the bonds they forged, spark something bolder? What might push these artisans to turn their skills against the empire that shackled them? Night falls over the workshop, the kilns cooling and the tools silent. The artisans rest in their ergastula, their hands still tingling from the day's labor, and the question of whether their skills could defy their chains hangs heavy. Here, in the quiet, you see the limits of their resistance and the enduring legacy of their craft. These enslaved craftsmen built Rome's beauteous, mosaics, statues, and tools, yet their lives were spent in obscurity. Their resilience, a testament to the human spirit. Their work was essential, adorning temples like the Pantheon or crafting weapons for legions. As Pliny the Elder's accounts of Roman craftsmanship suggest, yet they remained property, their lives precarious. A failed project could lead to sale or harsher labor, as Plutarch notes of artisans sent to mines. Skeletal remains from workshop sites show signs of repetitive strain and burns, evidence of their grueling days. You might picture a mosaist, her fingers calloused, piecing together a villa's floor, her own story buried beneath the tiles. Manumission was rare but possible. Freedmen, like the sculptor Phidias, noted in a Roman epitaph, gained freedom through exceptional skill, but most toiled until death. Their names unrecorded towed resistance was subtle yet persistent. Some artisans sabotaged, were cracking a pot or misaligning a tile's rare archaeological finds of flawed artifacts suggest. Others taught their craft to fellow slaves, preserving traditions, as graffiti from Pompey's workshops hint. These acts risked severe punishment, flogging, or branding. Per the Digest, but showed a refusal to be fully owned. During rebellions like the Servile Wars, artisan skills were vital, crafting makeshift weapons, as Diodorus Siculus implies. Yet, their isolation in workshops limited organized defiance, and Rome's strict laws, like the Lex Fabia, curbed unrest by restricting slave movements. Their legacy endures in Rome's artifacts, the mosaics of Ostia, the aqueducts' iron fittings, the pottery in every market. Their labor fueled the empire's aesthetic and economic power. Yet its reliance on slaves stifled innovation, contributing to decline by the 3rd century CE. As historians like Finlay argue, you might reflect on how their creations, still admired today, contrast with their forgotten lives. Echoing modern systems, where artisans' work is celebrated, but their struggles ignored. Their resiliency in hidden marks or shared skills speaks to a creativity that no chain could extinguish. As you leave this workshop, consider the cost of Rome's beauty. What does it mean to craft a civilization's splendor in chains? And how do these artisans' silent contributions challenge us to honor the unseen creators of our own world? Story 10. The Quarry's Burden. Hewing stone for Rome's Monumentsier, standing at the edge of a sprawling Roman quarry, where the air is thick with dust and the sharp clink of chisels echoes off towering stone walls. Enslaved quarry workers, their bodies coated in sweat and grit, toil under the relentless sun, carving the marble and limestone that will build Rome's temples and arches. These laborers, often prisoners of war or condemned criminals, were the unseen muscle behind the empire's monumental architecture. As you watch them swing mallets and haul massive blocks, you feel the crushing weight of their labor, their lives bound to the stone they shaped for Rome's glory in the 1st century BCE. Quarries, like those at Carrara or Mons Claudianus, supplied the raw materials for Rome's iconic structures, as described in Strabo's Geographica. Most workers were damnati ad lapidinas, slaves sentenced to the quarries, drawn from conquered regions like Gaul or Egypt. You might picture a Numidian captive, his hands scarred, chipping away at a marble vein, his every strike driven by an overseer's whip. The work was brutal, cutting stone with iron tools, hauling blocks with ropes, or clearing rubble. As Pliny the Elder details, dust clogged their lungs, and accidents, falling rocks or tool slips were common, as archaeological finds of fractured bones in quarry sites confirm. Living conditions were dire. Slaves slept in crude barracks near the quarry, often chained on straw mats in dusty, cramped spaces, per Diodorus Siculus. Their diet was minimal stale bread, water, and occasional salted fish, barely sustaining their grueling labor, as skeletal remains show signs of malnutrition. Clothing was rudimentary, tattered tunics and sandals worn to threads against jagged stone. Medical care was scarce. A broken limb often meant death or replacement, as slaves were expendable, per the Digest. The quarry's noise and dust were constant, leaving workers with chronic coughs or impaired vision. As Galen's medical texts note, the quarries were engines of Rome's ambition, supplying stone for the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and countless statues. Overseers, often freedmen, enforced brutal quotas. using whips or starvation to ensure output, as inscriptions from Egyptian quarries reveal. Yet, amidst the toil, you might notice flickers of humanity, a shared sip of water, a whispered curse in a native tongue. These slaves, stripped of freedom, clung to fragments of their past, their labor carving the empire's legacy into stone. As you stand amid the quarry's clamor, you wonder, how did these workers endure such relentless hardship? What strength or defiance kept them from breaking under the weight of the stone and the empire? The quarry's din grows louder as the sun climbs, dust swirling around slaves who chip away at stone with relentless precision. The question of their endurance lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their labor, you see a grim dance of survival and subtle defiance. These quarry workers, toiling to extract marble and limestone, were the backbone of Rome's monumental architecture. Their strength exploited in a system designed to break them. You can feel the strain in their muscles. Each swing of the mallet a testament to resilience under crushing oppression. The work was punishingly methodical. Slaves used wedges and chisels to split stone, a process requiring both skill and brute force, as Vitruvius describes in De Architectura. Some operated levers to move blocks weighing tons, their bodies strained to the limit, while others cleared debris, their hands blistered from jagged rocks. You might picture a Gaulish slave, his back bent, dragging a limestone slab, pausing only when the overseer's gaze shifts. Accidents were frequent, crushed limbs or falls from scaffolds, as archaeological evidence from Carrara shows, with skeletons bearing signs of trauma. Overseers enforced quotas, demanding enough stone daily to fill carts bound for Rome. As inscriptions from Mons Claudianus detail, failure meant lashings or reduced rations. Per the Corpus Juris, Civilis. Survival required both physical endurance and cunning. Workers shared techniques to ease their labor, like angling chisels to reduce strain, as tool marks on quarry stones suggest. Some hoarded water or hid small tools to lighten their load, acts of quiet resistance, risking punishment, as the digest notes. Bonds formed in the barracks, where slaves whispered stories of their homeland's Egyptian deserts or Thracian mountains, preserving their identities, as rare graffiti from quarry sites indicate. Yet trust was fragile. Informing on a fellow slave could earn extra food, as legal records show. Escape was nearly impossible. Branded or chained, damnati faced recapture or death, as Tacitus' accounts of runaway slaves confirm. The quarry's output was staggering: marble for Trajan's column, limestone for aqueducts, yet the human cost was immense. Slaves were expendable. When one fell, another replaced him, as market records from Rome reveal. You might imagine a father and son working side by side, their shared glances a flicker of hope in a brutal world. Their labor built Rome's enduring monuments, but their lives were erased, their names unrecorded, as the day fades and the workers trudge to their barracks. You sense a spark beneath their exhaustion. Could these small acts of defiance, shared water, hidden tools, grow into something greater? What might push these slaves to turn their strength against the empire they built? Night blankets the quarry, the clatter of tools replaced by the soft groans of exhausted slaves in their barracks. The question of whether their defiance could challenge their chains lingers, And here, in the stillness, you see the limits of their resistance and the enduring legacy of their labor. These quarry workers, hewing stone for Rome's monuments, were the invisible force behind the empire's grandeur, their lives spent in toil, their resilience etched into the very stones they carved. Rebellion in the quarries was rare but not unknown. The physical strength and tools of quarry slaves made them dangerous, as seen in the Second Servile War, 104 to 100 BCE, where some joined rebels, using their chisels as weapons, per Diodorus Siculus. You might imagine a slave, his hands hardened from years of cutting marble, sabotaging a block to delay quotas. Such acts were risky punishments, included crucifixion or transfer to mines, as the digest records. Most resistance was quieter, slowing work, hiding tools, or carving small symbols into stone, as archaeological finds from Carrara suggest. These acts, though small, showed a refusal to be fully broken, despite Rome's tight control, reinforced by laws like the Lex Fabia restricting slave movements. The human cost was staggering. Bioarchaeological studies of quarry sites reveal lifespans rarely exceeding 30 years, with bodies ravaged by dust-induced lung disease and broken bones. You might picture a young man, his lungs scarred, collapsing under a limestone block, his life unrecorded but his labor immortalized in the Arch of Titus. Manumission was nearly non-existent. Unlike household slaves, quarry workers were rarely freed, their value tied to physical output, as inscriptions from Mons Claudianus show. Yet, their work endures: marble in the Pantheon, limestone in aqueducts shaping Rome's legacy. As Pliny the Elder's descriptions confirm, the quarry's legacy is twofold. They built Rome's iconic skyline, but their reliance on slave labor exposed economic flaws. Overexploitation stifled technological advances, contributing to the empire's decline by the 3rd century CE. As historians like Finlay argue, the slaves' resiliency in shared stories or careful burials of comrades, found in mass graves, speaks to a humanity that outlasted their chains. You might reflect on how their stones, still standing, mirror modern systems where laborers' struggles are forgotten behind grand projects. As you leave the quarry, consider the weight of their burden. What does it mean to build an empire's monuments on the backs of the enslaved? And how do these workers' silent endurance challenge us to see the human cost behind our own city's splendor? Story 11. The Mines of Despair. Digging wealth from darkness. CR, standing at the mouth of a Roman mine, where the air is heavy with damp earth and the distant clank of pickaxes echoes from deep within. Enslaved miners, their faces streaked with grime, toil in flickering torchlight, extracting gold, silver, or iron to fuel Rome's wealth. These workers, often damnati ad metallum condemned to the mines, were the empire's most expendable, their lives consumed by the darkness of the earth. As you peer into the shadowed tunnels, you feel the suffocating weight of their labor. Each swing of the pick, a struggle against both stone and servitude. In the 1st century BC, mines like those in Laurian Greece or Hispania supplied Rome's economy, as described in Strabo's Geographica. Most miners were war captives, criminals, or rebellious slaves, sentenced to a fate worse than death, per Pliny the Elder. You might picture a Dacian prisoner, his wrists chained, hacking at a silver vein in a cramped shaft, his body battered by The work was relentless, digging tunnels, hauling or smelting metal in choking furnaces. As archaeological evidence from Rio Tinto shows, dust and fumes scarred their lungs, and cave-ins were common, with mass graves revealing crushed skulls and broken limbs. Conditions were hellish. Miners lived in crude barracks or underground cells, sleeping on damp stone or straw, often chained, as Diodorus Siculus describes. Their diet was meager spoiled bread, water, and rare scraps of meat, leading to malnutrition, as skeletal remains confirm. Clothing was minimal, tattered rags offering little protection against sharp rocks or cold depths. Medical care was non-existent. Injuries festered, and disease like silicosis was rampant, as Galen's texts note. You might see a boy, barely a teenager, hauling or baskets, his eyes dull from exhaustion and fear. The mines were Rome's economic engine, producing metals for coins, weapons, and luxuries. As inscriptions from Carthago Nova detail, overseers, often freedmen, enforced brutal quotas with whips or starvation, per the digest. Yet, amidst this despair, you notice faint glimmers of humanity, a miner sharing a crust of bread, a whispered prayer to a native god. These slaves, stripped of everything, clung to fragments of hope or defiance, their labor enriching an empire that discarded them. As you linger at the mine's edge, you wonder, how did these miners endure such crushing despair? What kept their spirits from breaking in the darkness, and what flickered in their hearts as they dug for Rome's wealth? The mine's depths hum with the relentless rhythm of pickaxes, the air thick with dust that chokes the lungs. The question of how these miners endured lingers, and here, in the dim tunnels, you see a grim struggle for survival amid unrelenting hardship. These enslaved workers, condemned to extract Rome's wealth, balanced on the edge of despair, their bodies and spirits tested by the darkness. You can sense the strain in their trembling hands, each strike against stone, a fight to preserve a shred of humanity. The work was mercilessly repetitive. Miners chipped away at or veins with iron picks, their movements constrained by narrow shafts, as described in Pliny's Naturalis Historia. Some hauled heavy baskets of rock to the surface, their backs bent under the weight, while others smelted or in blistering furnaces. As archaeological evidence from Lorien shows, you might picture a Thracian slave, his face caked with soot, coughing as he swings his pick, knowing a missed quota could mean a lash or worse, per the Corpus Juris Civilis. The constant threat of cavins or toxic fumes loomed. Skeletal remains from Hispania reveal lungs scarred by silica and bones broken by falling rock. Overseers enforced brutal efficiency, their whips a constant reminder of Rome's demands. As inscriptions from Dacia's mines note, survival demanded both endurance and ingenuity. Miners shared tactics to conserve strength, like alternating swings to spare their arms, as tool wear patterns suggest. Some hid small bits of ore or food scraps, risking brutal punishment, flogging, or starvation for a moment's relief, as the digest records. In the barracks, they whispered tales of their homeland's Gaulish forests or Egyptian sands, keeping memories alive, as rare graffiti in mine tunnels indicate. Yet, trust was scarce. Informing on a fellow slave could earn extra rations, as legal texts show. Escape was a fantasy. chained and branded. Miners faced death in the wilderness or recapture. Per Tacitus, accounts of fugitivi. The mines fueled Rome's prosperity. Gold for coins, iron for legions, yet the human cost was immense. Miners were replaceable. When one fell, another was sent into the depths, as market records from Rome confirm. You might imagine two slaves, their eyes meeting in the torchlight, sharing a fleeting nod of solidarity. Their labor built the empire's wealth, but their lives were erased, their names unrecorded as the miners trudged to their cells, their bodies aching. You sense a faint spark beneath their exhaustion. Could these small acts of defiance, shared stories, hidden scraps ignite something greater? What might push these broken souls to rise against the empire that buried them in darkness? Night seals the mine, the tunnels silent save for the faint drip of water and the labored breathing of slaves in their cells. The question of whether their defiance could break their chains lingers. And here, in the darkness, you see the limits of their resistance and the profound legacy of their toil. These miners, condemned to dig Rome's wealth, were the empire's sacrificial fuel. Their lives extinguished in the depths, yet their labor shaped its power. Their resilience, though nearly crushed, left traces in the stone they carved. Rebellion was rare, but not impossible. The mine's isolation and brutal conditions made organized resistance difficult. Yet some joined uprisings, like the Second Servile War, 104 to 100 BCE, wielding picks as weapons, as Diodorus Siculus recounts. You might imagine a slave, his body worn, smashing a chain in a fleeting act of defiance. Though such acts often led to crucifixion, per the Digest. Most resistance was quieter, slowing work, hiding, or carving symbols into tunnel walls. As archaeological finds from Rio Tinto suggest, these small rebellions, risking flogging or death, showed a spirit that refused to be fully broken. Despite laws like the Lex Fabia curbing slave movements, the human cost was staggering. Miners' lifespans were short, often under 25 years, with bodies ravaged by disease and injury, as bioarchaeological studies from Lorien reveal. You might picture a young miner, his lungs choked with dust, collapsing in a shaft, his labor feeding Rome's mints, but his name forgotten. Manumission was virtually non-existent. Miners were too expendable, replaced swiftly, as inscriptions from Hispania's mines confirm. Yet, their work was vital gold for Nero's coins, iron for legions, swords powering the empire's economy, as Pliny the Elder notes. Their only legacy was the wealth they extracted, not their lives. The mine's impact on Rome was double. They enriched the empire, funding conquests and luxuries. But their reliance on slave labor stifled technological progress, contributing to economic decline by the 3rd century CE. As historians like Finlay argue, the miners' resilience seen in shared prayers or careful burials in mass graves speaks to a humanity that endured despite despair. You might reflect on how their toil mirrors modern extractive industries, where workers' sacrifices are buried beneath profits. Their silent endurance, etched in every coin or blade, challenges us to see the cost of wealth. As you leave the mine's darkness, consider the price of Rome's prosperity. What does it mean to build an empire on lives lost in the depths? And how do these miners' struggles urge us to confront the human toll of our own wealth? Story 12. The Forgotten Overseers. Enforcing Rome's will in Chainsier, standing in the dusty courtyard of a Roman estate, where the sharp crack of a whip cuts through the morning air. An enslaved overseer, Avilicus, stands tall, his eyes scanning a group of field slaves as they begin their labor. These overseers, often slaves themselves, were tasked with enforcing Rome's will, managing fellow captives with a mix of authority and shared suffering. Caught between their master's demands and the resentment of those they supervised, their lives were a complex web of duty and despair. As you watch the Avilicus bark orders, you feel the tension of his role, both enforcer and enslaved. His whip, a symbol of power and a reminder of his chains. In the 1st century BCE, overseers were critical to Rome's vast estates, mines, and workshops, as described in Cato's De Agri, often chosen from among the enslaved for their strength or cunning. Velici managed labor, ensured quotas, and reported to masters, as inscriptions from Pompey's villas show. You might picture a Thracian, once a warrior, now a Avilicus, overseeing olive harvests, his voice sharp but his hands scarred from past toil. Their tasks included assigning work, disciplining slaves, and maintaining tools, all under the threat of punishment for failure, per the digest. Their role demanded loyalty to the master, yet their status as slaves bred distrust among their peers. Life for overseers was marginally better than for other slaves. They often lived in separate quarters, with slightly better food, bread, wine, and occasional meatas, columellas, treatises note. Yet their conditions were still harsh, sleeping on straw mats, wearing worn tunics, and facing constant pressure to meet quotas, as archaeological finds from rural estates confirm. Injuries were less common than in mines or quarries, but stress and exhaustion took a toll, with skeletal remains showing signs of joint wear. Punishment for mismanagement was severe floggings or demotion to harder labor, as legal texts record. You might see the Avilicus pause, his gaze flickering with unease, knowing a single mistake could cost him everything. Overseers were the linchpins of Rome's slave system, ensuring the empire's fields and workshops ran smoothly. Yet their role isolated them, distrusted by both masters and slaves. You might notice small acts of humanity, Avilicus overlooking a minor error or sharing a sip of wine with a weary worker. These captives, torn between duty and empathy, carried the weight of their dual existence. There lives a microcosm of Rome's brutal hierarchy. As you linger in this courtyard, you wonder, how did these overseers navigate their conflicted role? What strength or defiance allowed them to balance their master's demands with the humanity they shared with those they oversaw? The sun climbs higher over the estate, and the Avilicus moves through the fields, his whip coiled but ever present as slaves toil under his watch. The question of how overseers navigated their conflicted role lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their oversight, you see a precarious balance of authority, fear, and fleeting compassion. These enslaved managers, tasked with enforcing Rome's will, walked a tightrope between their master's expectations and the shared suffering of their fellow slaves. You can sense the strain in the Avilicus's stern posture, his orders sharp, yet his eyes betraying a flicker of empathy. Their duties were relentless. Velici assigned tasks, ensured crops were harvested or goods produced, and reported progress to masters, as Varro's De Re Rustica details. You might picture a Villicus inspecting rows of wheat, noting each slave's output, knowing a shortfall could mean his own punishment. They maintained discipline, delivering lashes for laziness or errors, as the Corpus Juris Civilis records. Yet they also repaired tools or negotiated supplies, as inscriptions from Ostia's workshops show. The role required both physical presence and mental acuity, with overseers often managing dozens of slaves across sprawling estates. Failure, whether a poor harvest or a rebellious worker, could lead to demotion or sale. As legal texts note, survival demanded a delicate balance. Overseers learned to anticipate their master's moods, enforcing quotas with just enough severity to avoid suspicion. Yet some showed mercy when unseen, sparing a tired slave a beating, as rare accounts in Pliny the Younger's letters suggest. You might imagine a Villicus, once a field slave himself, slipping extra bread to a struggling worker, a quiet act of defiance, risking his own position. Bonds with other slaves were fragile. Resentment simmered among those they disciplined, and informing to gain favor was common, as the digest indicates. Yet, some Villici built trust, sharing stories of their past lives, perhaps a Gallic village or Syrian market during rare breaks. As graffiti from Pompey's estates hint, manumission was a distant hope, slightly more attainable for overseers due to their value. A loyal Villicus might earn freedom, like the freedman Tyro noted in Cicero's letters. But most remained enslaved, their authority a hollow privilege. Their role propped up Rome's economist states, fed cities. Workshops fueled trade, but isolated them, caught between masters and peers. You might see the Villicus pause, his whip lowered, gazing at the horizon, perhaps dreaming of a life beyond the estate, as the day wanes and the slaves trudge to their quarters. You sense a tension in the Villicus's silence. Could their empathy, or their own memories of servitude, spark defiance? What might push these conflicted overseers to challenge the system they upheld? Night falls over the estate, the fields silent, as the Villicus retires to his modest quarters, the weight of his whip heavy in his hand. The question of whether their empathy could spark defiance lingers, and here, in the stillness, you see the limits of their resistance and the profound impact of their role. These enslaved overseers, enforcing Rome's will while bound themselves, were the fragile gears of the empire's slave system, their lives a paradox of power and captivity. Their resilience, though strained, left a mark on the world they managed. Most Velizi never escaped their chains. Their role was vital, ensuring harvests, managing workshops, or overseeing mines fueled Rome's wealth, as Cato's agricultural writings confirm. Yet, they remained property, their authority. You might picture a Villicus, his shoulders stooped, tallying grain while haunted by the resentment of those he disciplined. Their lives were precarious. A failed crop or a rebellious slave could lead to flogging or demotion to brutal labor. As Plutarch notes of overseers sent to quarries, skeletal remains from estates show signs of stress injuries, reflecting the toll of their dual existence. Manumission was rare but possible. Loyal Velici, like Tyro, freed by Cicero, were exceptions, as inscriptions from Rome's Via Appia reveal. While most toiled until death. Resistance was subtle, but significant. Some velici sabotaged records or overlooked minor infractions, risking severe punishment, whipping or salus the digest records. Others shared knowledge, teaching slaves to maintain tools or avoid overseers' wrath, as graffiti from Pompey's villas suggest. In uprisings like the Servile Wars, velici occasionally joined rebels, their knowledge of estates aiding resistance, per Diodorus Siculus. Yet their position isolated them. Loyalty to masters clashed with empathy for peers, and Rome's laws, like the Lex Alia Sensia, limited their freedom. You might imagine a Villicus hiding a runaway's absence, a quiet act of defiance born from shared suffering. Their legacy underpinned Rome's prosperity. Their management ensured fields and workshops thrived, feeding cities and armies, as Pliny the Elder's accounts imply. Yet their reliance on coercion exposed the empire's fragility. Overexploitation bred unrest, contributing to economic strains. By the 3rd century CE, as Finlay argues, their resilient scene in moments of mercy or whispered camaraderie speaks to a humanity that endured despite their role. You might reflect on how their conflicted lives mirror modern systems of oversight, where authority masks shared struggle. As you leave the estate, consider the cost of their divided existence. What does it mean to enforce a system that enslaves you? And how do these overseers' quiet acts of empathy challenge us to question the structures we uphold today? Story 13, Shadows of the Arena, Gladiators and the Price of Spectaculaire, standing at the edge of a Roman amphitheater. The roar of the crowd vibrating through the stone as enslaved gladiators prepare for battle below. In the dim hypogeum, these warriors, captives, criminals, or debtors sharpen blades and strap on armor, their lives reduced to a brutal spectacle for Rome's entertainment. Their courage and skill enthralled the masses, but their existence was one of bloodshed and bondage. As you watch a Thracian gladiator adjust his helmet, his eyes fierce yet haunted, you feel the weight of a life where survival meant killing for the crowd's pleasure. In the 1st century BCE, gladiators were a cornerstone of Roman spectacle, as described in Livy's histories. Most were slaves, often prisoners of war from regions like Thrace or Gaul, or damnati ad ludum, condemned to fight, per the Digest. You might picture a Samnite warrior, once free, now training in a ludus to wield a sword for survival. Their fights, staged in arenas like Pompey's amphitheater, drew thousands, pitting retieri, net fighters, against murmillo, heavily armed gladiators. As detailed in Cicero's letters, each match was a gamble with death, with injuries, common broken bones, and gashes evidence by gladiator. Burials in Ephesus. Life in the ludus was harsh but structured. Gladiators trained daily, honing skills with wooden weapons. As Juvenal's satires note, they slept in cramped cells, often chained on straw pallets, per Diodorus Siculus. Their diet was robust barley, porridge, meat, and beans to build strength, though skeletal remains show signs of healed fractures and malnutrition. Clothing was minimal outside the arena, simple tunics with armor reserved for fights. Medical care was better than for most slaves, as Galen's accounts of treating gladiators suggest, but only to keep them fighting. You might see a young gladiator, his arm scarred, practicing thrusts under a trainer's whip. Gladiators were both despised and idolized, their victories earning fame but not freedom. The crowd's cheers fueled Rome's bloodlust, with games funding public loyalty, as Tacitus observes. Yet, amidst the brutality, you notice flickers of camaraderie. Gladiators sharing water or binding a comrade's wound. These warriors, stripped of autonomy, clung to honor and skill. There lives a stark symbol of Rome's cruel spectacle. As you linger in the hypogeum's shadows, you wonder, how did these gladiators endure the constant threat of death? What strength or defiance kept them fighting in an arena that demanded their blood for Rome's amusement? The amphitheater's roar intensifies as gladiators emerge into the arena, their armor glinting under the midday sun. The question of their endurance lingers, and here, in the clash of steel and the crowd's cheers, you see a grim balance of survival, skill, and defiance. These enslaved warriors, trained to kill or die for Rome's spectacle, navigated a world where each fight could be their last. You can sense the tension in their coiled muscles, each step a calculated act of courage in a life defined by violence and bondage. Training in the ludus was grueling, designed to forge fighters from captives. Gladiators drilled with heavy weapons, practicing thrusts and parries under harsh trainers, often freedmen, as Suetonius describes. You might picture a Gaulish Retiarius, his net in hand, sparring with a Murmillo, learning to dodge blows that could kill. Matches were not always fatal, but injuries were inevitable cuts, fractures, or concussions, as skeletal remains from Rome's gladiator cemeteries show. The lanista trainer enforced discipline with whips or starvation, per the Corpus Juris Civilis, ensuring fighters performed for the crowd. Outside the arena, gladiators faced isolation. Their fame drew fans, but their status as slaves barred true freedom, as graffiti from Pompeii's Ludus reveals. Survival demanded both physical prowess and mental cunning. Gladiators studied opponents, learning to exploit weaknesses, as inscriptions honoring skilled fighters like Flamma suggest. Some formed bonds in the ludus, sharing tactics or food, a quiet rebellion against their trainers' control, as archaeological finds of communal items indicate. Yet betrayal loomed. A rival might sabotage another for favor, as legal records note. You might imagine a gladiator, his face grim, binding a comrade's wound in secret, knowing the next fight could pit them against each other. Escape was rare. Chained and guarded, runaways faced execution, as Tacitus' accounts of fugitivi confirm. Manumission was a faint hope earned through repeated victories. A rude's wooden sword symbolized freedom, granted to rare champions like Spartacus before his rebellion, as Appian recounts. Most, however, fought until death or disability, their bodies discarded as mass graves show. Their performances fueled Rome's social order, pacifying crowds with bloodshed, as Pliny the Younger observes. You might see a gladiator, his chest heaving, saluting the crowd. His pride a flicker of defiance in a system that owned him. As the arena clears and the survivors return to their cells, you sense a smoldering resolve. Could their camaraderie or skill spark rebellion against their fate? What might push these warriors to turn their blades against the empire that cheered their bloodshed? Night descends on the ludus, the arena silent as gladiators rest in their cells, the clank of chains mingling with their heavy breaths. The question of whether their resolve could spark rebellion lingers, and here in the stillness, you see the limits of their defiance and the lasting impact of their brutal lives. These enslaved warriors, fighting for Rome's amusement, were both spectacles and sacrifices, their courage fueling the empire's bloodlust while their resistance hinted at its fragility. Their scars tell a story of survival and loss. Most gladiators never escaped the arena's cycle. Their fights, staged to thrill crowds, often ended in death or crippling injury. As skeletal remains from Ephesus reveal, with gashes and fractures marking their bones, you might picture a Thracian Murmillo, his body scarred, facing yet another opponent, knowing survival meant another fight. Training was relentless, with Laniste pushing slaves to perfect deadly techniques, as Martial's epigrams describe. Manumission was rare. Only exceptional fighters, like Spartacus, earned the rudies. As Appian notes, while most perished, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, per archaeological evidence. Escape attempts were futile, with guards and brands ensuring recapture. As Tacitus details, resistance was both subtle and explosive. In the Ludus, gladiators shared whispered plans or sabotaged equipment, risking flogging or execution, as the Digest records. The Third Servile War, 7371 BCE, led by Spartacus, showed their potential for rebellion, with gladiators using their combat skills to challenge Rome, as Plutarch recounts. Yet, most defiance was quieter, a salute to a fallen comrade or a carved name in a cell, as graffiti from Pompeii's amphitheater suggests. These acts preserved their humanity in a system that saw them as tools. You might imagine a gladiator, his hands bloodied, etching a symbol of his homeland, defying Rome's erasure of his identity. Their legacy shaped Rome's culture and economy. Gladiatorial games reinforced social control, pacifying the masses, as juveniles bred and circuses, quip implies. Yet their exploitation sowed seeds of unrest, with rebellions exposing Rome's dependence on slaves, as Finlay argues, contributing to its decline by the 3rd century CE. Their courage, seen in every fight or shared glance, echoes in modern struggles against exploitation. You might reflect on how their blood-soaked arena mirrors systems, where humans' lives fuel spectacle. As you leave the Ludus, consider the cost of Rome's entertainment. What does it mean to build a culture on the sacrifice of captive warriors? And how do these gladiators' fleeting acts of defiance challenge us to honor the humanity behind our own spectacles? Story 14. The Silent Servants, Domestic Slaves and Rome's Hidden Laboureur, standing in the bustling atrium of a Roman domus, where the soft clatter of dishes and the rustle of tunics signal the work of domestic slaves. These silent servants, cooks, cleaners, and personal attendants move through the household, their hands busy with tasks that keep the elite's lives seamless. Enslaved men, women, and children, often born into servitude or captured from distant lands, were the unseen heart of Rome's domestic life. As you watch a young maid scrub a mosaic floor, her eyes lowered, you feel the weight of a life spent serving in the shadows of opulence. In the 1st century BC, domestic slaves were essential to Roman households, as noted in Verros de Re. Many were Verni, born into slavery, or captives from regions like Syria or Gaul, valued for their loyalty or skills. You might picture a Greek cook, once a free artisan, now preparing feasts in a patrician's kitchen, his expertise unacknowledged. Their tasks were diverse: cleaning, cooking, childcare, or attending to master's needs. As inscriptions from Pompey's villas detail, precision was critical. A poorly cooked meal or a stained tunic could earn a beating. Per the Digest, life was grueling despite the proximity to luxury. Domestic slaves slept in cramped quarters, often a corner of the domus, or ergastulon, straw mats, as Diodorus Siculus describes. Their diet was basic: bread, olives, and watered wine, with scraps from the master's table, as skeletal remains show signs of malnutrition. Clothing was simple, often cast-off tunics, marked to denote their status. Per legal records, you might see a child slave, barely 10, carrying a heavy water jug, his small frame dwarfed by the task. Discipline was harsh. A spilled tray or a moment's rest could lead to lashes. As Juvenile's satires note, these slaves were the backbone of Rome's elite households, their labor enabling the leisure of the wealthy. Yet they were invisible, their presence expected but ignored. You might notice small acts of humanity: a cook sharing a crust with a fellow slave, or a maid humming a tune from her homeland. These captives, living in the heart of Rome's splendor, carried memories of freedom or family, their work sustaining a world that dehumanized them. As you linger in this domus, you wonder, how did these domestic slaves endure the constant demands of servitude? What strength or subtle defiance kept their spirits alive in a household that saw them as mere tools? The domus hums with activity as the day unfolds, domestic slaves weaving through rooms with practiced efficiency. The question of their endurance lingers, and here, in the rhythm of their tasks, you see a delicate balance of submission and quiet resilience. These silent servants, cooks, maids, and attendants sustained Rome's elite households, their labor invisible yet essential, their lives shaped by relentless demands and fleeting moments of humanity. You can sense the strain in their careful movements, each task a testament to survival in a world that owned them. Their duties were endless and varied. Cooks prepared elaborate banquets, balancing flavors under scrutiny, as Apicius' recipes imply. Maids cleaned mosaics or laundered linens, their hands raw from lye, while attendants dressed masters or tended children, as inscriptions from Herculaneum detail. You might picture a Syrian maid, her fingers nimble, folding a senator's toga, knowing a single crease could earn a slap. Per the Corpus Juris Civilis, work stretched from dawn to late night, with no rest. Overseers, often senior slaves, enforced discipline, and errors like a broken dish could lead to flogging or reduced rations. As the Digest notes, survival required both skill and caution. Domestic slaves learned to anticipate their master's whims, perfecting tasks to avoid punishment. Yet, they found ways to preserve their dignity. You might imagine a cook slipping a spice from his homeland into a dish, or a nursemaid whispering stories to a slave child. Acts of subtle defiance, risking discovery, as graffiti from Pompey's domus suggest. Bonds formed in quiet moments, sharing food scraps, or helping with Tacitus's archaeological finds of communal spaces indicate. Yet, trust was fragile. Informing on a fellow slave could earn favor, as legal records show. Escape was nearly impossible. with urban patrols and branded marks ensuring recapture. Per Tacitus' accounts of fugitivi, manumission was a faint hope, more attainable for domestic slaves due to their proximity to masters. Loyal servants, like the freedwoman Acta, noted in Nero's household, could earn freedom, as inscriptions from Rome's Columbaria reveal. Yet, most remained enslaved, their skills binding them to the domus. Their labor upheld Rome's social order, enabling elite leisure. As Pliny the Younger's letters imply, you might see a maid, her face weary, polishing silver, her thoughts drifting to a lost family. As the household settles for the night, you sense a quiet strength in their silence. Could these small acts of defiance hidden stories, shared scraps grow into something bolder? What might push these silent servants to challenge the system that confined them? Night cloaks, the domus, the household quiet as domestic slaves retire to their cramped quarters, their hands still aching from the day's labor. The question of whether their defiance could challenge their servitude lingers, and here, in the stillness, you see the limits of their resistance and the enduring impact of their unseen work. These silent servants, sustaining Rome's elite, were the invisible foundation of its opulence, their resilience a testament to humanity under oppression. Their lives, though hidden, shaped the empire's heart. Most domestic slaves never escaped servitude. Their work cooking, cleaning, or tending children was essential to the domos, enabling the elite's lavish lifestyle, as Seneca's writings on household management imply. Yet they remained property, their lives precarious. A master's displeasure could mean sale or punishment, as Plutarch notes of slaves sent to harsher roles. You might picture a nursemaid, her eyes tired, soothing a patrician child while her own was sold years ago. Per market records from Ostia, skeletal remains from urban sites show signs of repetitive strain, reflecting their relentless tasks. Manumission was possible. Loyal maids or cooks, like Acta, gained freedom. As Rome's Columbaria inscriptions show, but most toiled until death. Their names unrecorded. Resistance was subtle but vital. Some slaves sabotaged tasks, oversalting a dish, or misplacing a master's ring, risking flogging, as the digest records. Others shared knowledge, teaching younger slaves to read or cook, as graffiti from Herculaneum's kitchens suggest. In rare rebellions, like the Servile Wars, domestic slaves provided insider knowledge, aiding uprisings, per Diodorus Siculus. Yet, their proximity to masters limited bold defiance. Rome's laws, like the Lex Alia Sensia, restricted their freedom, and urban patrols curbed escapes, as Tacitus notes. You might imagine a cook, his hands steady, slipping a forbidden herb into a stew, a quiet act of rebellion born from memory. Their legacy underpinned Rome's social fabric. Their labor ensured households ran smoothly, supporting the elite who governed the empire, as Pliny the Elder's accounts of urban life suggest. Yet, their exploitation revealed Rome's flaws. Dependence on slave labor bred complacency, contributing to economic stagnation by the 3rd century CE. As Finlay argues, their resiliency in shared songs or hidden acts of kindness goes in modern struggles for dignity in unseen labor. You might reflect on how their work, though uncelebrated, sustained Rome's grandeur. Much like today's overlooked workers, as you leave the domus, consider the cost of its elegance. What does it mean to build a society on the silent toil of the enslaved? And how do these servants' quiet acts of defiance challenge us to honor the unseen labor in our own world? Story 15: The Chains of Commerce, Enslaved Merchants, and Rome's Market Hour. Standing in the bustling Macellum of Rome, where the air hums with haggling voices and the clink of coins. Among the stalls, enslaved merchants, vendors, accountants, and brokers manage trade, their sharp minds navigating the empire's commerce. These captives, often from Greece or the East, were the unseen engines of Rome's markets, their skills in numbers and negotiation exploited to enrich their masters. As you watch a Syrian slave tally a sale of olives, his eyes scanning a wax tablet, you feel the weight of a life where intellect served profit, but freedom remained out of reach in the 1st century BCE. Rome's economy thrived on enslaved labor in trade. As noted in Pliny, the Elder's Naturalis Historia, captives with literacy or mercantile experience, often from Hellenistic cities, were prized for managing stalls, keeping accounts, or brokering deals, as inscriptions from Ostia's markets show. You might picture a Greek slave, once a trader in Athens, now selling wine for his master, his quick calculations ensuring profit. Their tasks demanded precision. Errors in ledgers or negotiations could lead to a beating, per the Digest. They worked in crowded markets or ports, handling goods from spices to textiles. As archaeological finds from Pompeii's shops confirm, life was demanding despite the urban setting. Enslaved merchants lived in cramped rooms above shops or in ergastula, sleeping on straw mats, as Diodorus Siculus describes. Their diet was basic bread, olives, and watered wine, adequate but sparse, with skeletal remains showing signs of malnutrition. Clothing was functional, simple tunics, sometimes marked to denote slavery, per legal records. You might see a young slave, his fingers stained with ink, balancing a ledger under the watchful eye of an overseer. The constant pressure to meet quotas strained their health, with evidence of repetitive strain in their hands. As medical texts like Galen suggest, these slaves were vital to Rome's commerce, their work fueling the flow of goods across the empire. Yet, they were tools, their expertise unacknowledged. You might notice small acts of resilience, a merchant slipping a coin to a fellow slave or whispering market tips in a native tongue. These captives, often educated, carried memories of freer lives, their skills a bridge between their past and Rome's profit-driven present. As you linger in the Macellum's clamor, you wonder, how did these enslaved merchants endure the demands of commerce while bound? What strength or defiance kept their spirits alive? The Macellum pulses with life as merchants shout prices and slaves weave through crowds, their hands busy with coins and goods. The question of how enslaved merchants endured lingers. And here, in the rhythm of trade, you see a delicate balance of skill, caution, and quiet defiance. These captives, vendors, accountants, and brokers drove Rome's markets, their expertise exploited to fuel commerce, yet their lives were bound by chains. You can sense the strain in their precise movements, each transaction a testament to resilience in a system that profited from their servitude. Their tasks required sharp intellect and adaptability. Enslaved merchants haggled with customers, managed inventories, or calculated profits, as inscriptions from Ostia's Tabernae detail. You might picture an Egyptian slave, once a scribe, now keeping a shop's accounts, his stylus scratching numbers under a master's scrutiny. Errors, a miscalculated sum, or a lost sale could lead to flogging or sale, per the Corpus Juris Civilis. They worked long hours in noisy markets, handling goods like grain, wine, or cloth. As archaeological finds from Pompeii's stalls show, the pressure was relentless. A single mistake could disrupt trade, and overseers enforced quotas with harsh discipline, as legal records note. These slaves learned to read their masters' expectations, perfecting deals to avoid punishment, yet they found ways to preserve their identity. You might imagine a vendor slipping a small item to a fellow slave, or teaching a younger captive to count coins, acts of defiance, risking discovery, as graffiti from Herculaneum's markets suggest. Bonds formed in quiet moments, sharing tips or a sip of wine, as finds of communal spaces in shop back rooms indicate. Yet, trust was fragile. Informing on a pier could earn extra rations, per the digest. Escape was nearly impossible, with market patrols and branded marks ensuring recapture. As Tacitus' accounts of fugitivi confirm, manumission was a faint hope, more attainable for skilled merchants due to their value. A loyal accountant, like the freedman Crescens, noted in Rome's inscriptions, could earn freedom, but most remained enslaved, their skills tying them to their master's wealth. Their work powered Rome's economy, linking ports to cities, as Pliny the Younger's letters imply. You might see a slave, his face lined with fatigue, weighing grain, his thoughts drifting to a lost marketplace in Alexandria. As the market quiets and the slaves retire to their quarters, you sense a simmering resolve. Could their small acts of defiance, hidden coins, shared knowledge, spark something greater? What might push these merchants to turn their skills against the empire that exploited them? Night falls over the Masalum, the stalls empty as enslaved merchants retire to their cramped quarters, their hands still tingling from the day's calculations. The question of whether their defiance could challenge their servitude lingers. And here, in the silence, you see the limits of their resistance and the enduring impact of their labor. These captives, driving Rome's commerce, were the invisible cogs of its economy, their resilience a testament to the human spirit under exploitation. Their work, though uncelebrated, shaped the empire's wealth. Most enslaved merchants never escaped their bonds. Their skills haggling, accounting, or brokering kept markets thriving, linking Rome to its provinces, as Cicero's letters on trade suggest. Yet they remained property, their lives precarious. A failed deal or a master's whim could lead to sale or punishment, as Plutarch notes of slaves sent to harsher roles. You might picture a Greek vendor, his eyes weary, balancing a final ledger, his own dreams of freedom buried beneath numbers. Skeletal remains from urban sites show signs of repetitive strain, reflecting their relentless tasks. Manumission was possible. Loyal merchants, like Crescens, gained freedom, as inscriptions from Ostia reveal, but most toiled until death, their names erased. Resistance was subtle but meaningful. Some merchants manipulated accounts or hid small profits to aid fellow slaves, risking flogging, as the digest records. Others taught literacy or trade tricks to younger captives, preserving knowledge, as graffiti from Pompeii's shops hint. In rare rebellions, like the Servile Wars, enslaved merchants provided resources or information, aiding uprisings, per Diodorus Siculus. Yet, their visibility in markets limited bold defiance. Rome's laws, like the Lex Alea Sensia, restricted their freedom, and patrols ensured compliance, as Tacitus notes. You might imagine a broker, his voice low, sharing a coin with a struggling slave. A quiet act of rebellion born from shared hardship. Their legacy powered Rome's economy. Their labor-ensured goods flowed from Egypt to Gaul, sustaining cities and armies, as Pliny the Elder's accounts of trade imply. Yet, their exploitation exposed Rome's flaws. Reliance on slave labor stifled innovation, contributing to economic stagnation by the 3rd century CE, as Finlay argues. Their resiliency in hidden acts, or whispered camaraderie echoes in modern struggles for dignity in labor. You might reflect on how their work, though uncredited, mirrors today's unseen workers in global markets. As you leave the Macellum, consider the cost of Rome's prosperity. What does it mean to build an economy on the minds of the enslaved? And how do these merchants' quiet acts of defiance challenge us to value the unseen labor behind our own wealth?